My son auctioned me off for $2 at his charity gala. He laughed into the microphone in front of 500 elite guests asking who wanted his boring dad. I sat there in my rented tuxedo, gripping my water glass as the entire ballroom erupted into laughter. I was completely humiliated. Then a stranger in the back of the room stood up and offered $2 million. What happened next drained the color completely from my son's face. I am Kenneth, 69 years old, and I am still processing the depth of my own family's betrayal. I spent my life as a software engineer working quietly in the background so my son could stand in the spotlight. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever sacrificed everything for a child who forgot where they came from. The Crystal Ballroom in downtown Chicago was dazzling that night. My daughter-in-law Abigail had organized the annual charity gala for my son Jordan's tech startup. The room smelled of roasted tenderloin and expensive floral arrangements. Jordan was the golden boy of the tech world, a 35-year-old CEO who had just secured his Series B funding. Abigail stood by the stage in a custom silk gown, holding a glass of champagne, looking down at the crowd with absolute triumph. I was seated at table 47, tucked away near the kitchen doors, sitting with junior marketing assistants who barely acknowledged my presence. I did not mind the seating arrangement. I was just proud to see my son succeed. I had spent countless nights over the decades writing the base code for the algorithms he now claimed as his sole genius. I never asked for credit. A father's greatest joy is supposed to be his son's victory. The evening's main event was a live auction. Jordan took the stage, his charismatic smile lighting up the room. He auctioned off a weekend on a yacht, a private dinner with a celebrity chef, and front-row tickets to a championship game. The wealthy investors in the room threw thousands of dollars around as if it were loose change. Jordan was thriving, feeding off the adoration of the crowd. But then he ran out of items. The crowd was still buzzing, demanding one more bid. Jordan looked around the room, his eyes scanning the tables until they landed on me in the back corner. A malicious smirk crossed his face. He leaned into the microphone. "We have one last item tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I present to you my father, Kenneth. He is a retired engineer who likes to talk about obsolete programming languages and falls asleep watching the History Channel at 8 in the evening. I am starting the bid at $2. Who wants my boring dad for the weekend?" The silence in the room lasted only a second before the laughter began. It started as a low chuckle from the VIP tables and spread like wildfire until the entire ballroom was laughing at me. Abigail covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with amusement. The junior assistants at my table looked at me with deep pity, leaning away as if failure was contagious. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. I looked at Jordan, waiting for him to say he was joking, waiting for him to transition to a real item. But he just stood there, basking in the cruel laughter, pointing at me. "Do I hear $2? Come on, someone take him off my hands. He makes a decent cup of instant coffee." I did not scream. I did not stand up and cause a scene. I just sat there feeling the bond between father and son shatter into a million irreparable pieces. I realized in that moment that I was not a father to him anymore. I was a prop. I was a reminder of a humble past he was desperate to erase in front of his wealthy white investors. Then a deep, resonant voice cut through the laughter. $2 million. The laughter died instantly. Heads snapped toward the back of the room. A man stepped out from the shadows near the grand entrance. He was older, perhaps in his early 60s, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He walked with a quiet authority that commanded the entire room. I recognized him immediately, though Jordan clearly did not. It was Dominic Thorne, the notoriously reclusive billionaire venture capitalist. Dominic never attended public galas. Yet here he was, walking slowly down the center aisle. Jordan gripped the microphone, his confident smile replaced by a look of sheer confusion. "Sir, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but this is a charity auction. We are just having a little fun with my father." Dominic did not stop walking until he reached the edge of the stage. He did not look at Jordan. He pulled a heavy fountain pen from his breast pocket and a checkbook. He wrote on the paper, the scratch of the pen echoing in the dead silent room. He tore the check free and turned away from the stage. He walked directly to table 47. The crowd parted for him. He stopped in front of me and placed the check on the table next to my water glass. It was made out to Kenneth for exactly $2 million. "I am not bidding on a weekend," Dominic said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom. "I am buying his freedom from you." Jordan dropped the microphone. It hit the stage with a loud electronic screech. Abigail dropped her champagne glass, the crystal shattering against the polished floor. Dominic looked down at me, gave a slight nod of deep respect, and walked out of the ballroom without another word. I picked up the check, folded it neatly, and placed it in my jacket pocket. I stood up, straightened my rented tie, and walked out of the hotel. I drove back to Jordan's estate in silence. I did not live in the main mansion. I lived in the small guest house near the rear gates. When I unlocked the door and turned on the lights, the small space felt incredibly cold. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the folded check in my hands. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a deep, hollow realization. The disrespect had not started tonight. It had been building for years. The skipped dinners, the condescending remarks from Abigail, the way they treated me like an inconvenience they had to manage. Tonight was just the grand finale. The heavy oak door of the guest house flew open, slamming against the drywall. Jordan and Abigail stormed inside. Jordan's face was purple with rage. He was breathing heavily, his tuxedo jacket discarded somewhere along the way. Abigail was right behind him, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed with pure venom. "What the hell was that?" Jordan screamed, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You hired an actor. You hired some old guy to come into my gala and humiliate me in front of my investors. Do you have any idea how much damage you just did to my company?" I looked up at him, my voice completely flat. "That was Dominic Thorne. If you were half the businessman you pretend to be, you would know who just walked away from your company." Jordan scoffed, pacing the small living room like a caged animal. "That was not Dominic Thorne. Dominic Thorne operates out of London. You arranged this because you are jealous. You are jealous that I built a multi-million-dollar company while you spent your life fixing broken servers for minimum wage. You just could not let me have my night." I felt a strange calm wash over me. It was the calm that comes when you finally accept that someone is truly lost to you. I looked around the guest house. 2 years ago, Jordan had come to me begging for help. His startup was failing. He needed to show physical assets to secure a massive loan. I had taken my entire retirement savings, $400,000, and built this guest house on his property. I put the deed entirely in his name to inflate his property value so the bank would approve his loan. I had sacrificed my financial security to save his dream, and in return, he allowed me to live in the structure I had paid for. Abigail stepped forward, her expensive heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "Let us get one thing straight, Kenneth," she said, her tone dripping with absolute disgust. "You are a guest on our property. We feed you, we tolerate your presence, and you repay us by orchestrating a public spectacle to ruin my husband. You are toxic." I stood up slowly. "I did not orchestrate anything. Your husband auctioned me off for $2. I simply survived the experience." Abigail let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You are playing the victim. How pathetic. Well, the victim act ends tonight. You are going to call whoever that man was, and you are going to force him to issue a public statement apologizing for the prank. You are going to tell the press that it was a misunderstanding. And if I refuse," I asked quietly. Jordan stopped pacing and stepped right into my personal space. "If you refuse, you are packing your bags tonight. You will be off my property by morning, and you will never, ever see your grandson Leo again. I will make sure of it." The threat hung in the air, heavy and violent. Leo was 3 years old. He was the only light in my life, the only reason I had endured their disrespect for so long. Abigail smiled, knowing she had played the ultimate trump card. She knew I would rather die than lose access to my grandson. They expected me to crumble. They expected me to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, to promise I would fix the public relations disaster they had created themselves. I looked at Jordan's furious eyes and Abigail's smug, victorious smile. I realized that arguing with them was useless. They had rewritten reality to suit their narrative. In their minds, they were the victims of my malice. I could not change them with words. I could only change the dynamic with actions. I turned my back on my son. I walked to the small closet, pulled out my leather suitcase, and placed it on the bed. I unzipped it and began folding my shirts. "What are you doing?" Jordan demanded, his voice faltering slightly. "I am packing," I replied, not looking back. "You think this is a game?" Abigail snapped. "If you walk out that door, you are dead to us. I will tell Leo his grandfather abandoned him because he was too selfish to support our family." I finished folding my clothes and zipped the suitcase shut. I walked over to the kitchen counter, took the key to the guest house off my keyring, and placed it gently next to the sink. I picked up my bag and walked toward the door. Jordan did not move out of the way immediately. He stared at me, perhaps waiting for the bluff to end. I looked him dead in the eye until he finally stepped aside. I walked out into the cold Chicago night. The wind bit through my thin jacket, but I did not feel the chill. I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded an old, useless man who had nothing left to offer. As I put my suitcase into the trunk of my old sedan, I pulled out my phone and looked at the time. It was past midnight. I opened my contacts and dialed a number I had saved for emergencies. The phone rang twice before a sharp voice answered. Thomas Reed, attorney at law. Thomas, it is Kenneth. I said, my breath turning to vapor in the cold air. Kenneth, it is late. Is everything all right? No, I replied, slamming the trunk shut. It is time to initiate Plan B. They just kicked me out. I heard the rustle of papers on the other end of the line. Understood. I will prepare the filings by morning. They have no idea what is coming. No, they do not, I said. I hung up the phone and got into my car. Jordan and Abigail believed they held all the power because their names were on the mansion and the bank accounts. They forgot one crucial detail. I was the one who wrote the original code. I was the one who filed the initial patents. And I was the one who had spent the last 6 months silently building a legal trap so tight they would never be able to breathe again. The era of my silent endurance was over. The correction had officially begun. The neon sign of the highway motel buzzed with a harsh electrical hum outside my window. I had not slept a single minute. My leather suitcase sat unopened on the stained carpet. I spent the hours between midnight and dawn staring at the digital clock on the nightstand, letting the reality of my new existence settle into my bones. Jordan and Abigail had successfully exiled me from the home I built for them. They thought I was currently wallowing in despair, broken by their cruelty. They were wrong. The initial shock had burned away, leaving behind a cold, calculating clarity. I checked my watch. It was 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. For the past 2 years, Tuesday meant only one thing. It was my day to pick up my 3-year-old grandson, Leo, from the Maplewood Early Learning Center. I put on a clean shirt, adjusted my coat, and walked out to my car. I was going to see my grandson. The preschool was nestled in an affluent suburban neighborhood surrounded by manicured lawns and high wrought iron fences. I parked my old sedan across the street and walked toward the main entrance. Usually the school director, a warm woman named Mrs. Gable, would greet me at the door with a bright smile. Today she was standing on the front porch with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Next to her stood a uniformed police officer. My chest tightened, but I kept my pace steady. I approached the concrete steps. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I am here for Leo." Mrs. Gable would not meet my eyes. She looked down at her clipboard, her knuckles white. "I am so sorry, Kenneth," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You cannot be here. You need to leave the premises immediately." Before I could ask why, the police officer stepped down and blocked my path. He was young, probably no older than Jordan. He placed a heavy hand on his utility belt. "Are you Kenneth Washington?" he asked sharply. I nodded. The officer pulled a folded manila envelope from his jacket and shoved it against my chest. "You have been served." I took the envelope and opened it. It was a court-issued document, a temporary restraining order. I scanned the legal jargon, my eyes locking onto the sworn affidavit attached to the back. It was signed by Abigail. The lies printed on the page were staggering. She claimed I had suffered a mental breakdown at the charity gala. She claimed I had become physically aggressive in the guest house. She cited early onset dementia and erratic violent tendencies. She had sworn under penalty of perjury that I was a direct danger to my grandson. They were not just keeping me away from Leo. They were legally assassinating my character, creating a paper trail to declare me incompetent so they would never have to pay me back the money I invested in their property. A black Range Rover pulled up to the curb directly behind my car. The tinted driver's side window rolled down smoothly. Abigail was behind the wheel, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding a sleek cup of artisan coffee. She did not get out of the vehicle. She simply watched me hold the restraining order, her lips curling into a triumphant smile. I walked slowly toward her car, stopping just short of the curb to comply with the officer's presence. Abigail lowered her sunglasses slightly, looking down her nose at me. "I warned you, Kenneth," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I told you that if you walked out that door, you would never see him again. You made your choice. You perjured yourself to get this order," I said quietly, holding up the document. "You are using a child as a weapon to protect your own ego." Abigail laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that cut through the crisp morning air. "Prove it. I am a respected socialite. Jordan is a tech visionary. You are an angry, displaced old man ranting on a sidewalk. Who do you think the judge is going to believe my lawyer drafted that document before breakfast? If you come within 500 feet of my son or my husband or my house, you will be arrested. You will spend your final years rotting in a state facility. Go back to whatever cheap motel you slept in, Kenneth. It is over. You lost." She rolled up the window, cutting off any possibility of a reply. The Range Rover sped away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with the police officer watching my every move. Abigail thought she had delivered the final crushing blow. She thought she had completely paralyzed me with the threat of the law. She severely underestimated the man she was dealing with. I folded the restraining order carefully and placed it into my inside jacket pocket. I did not yell at the officer. I did not plead with Mrs. Gable. I simply turned around, got into my car, and drove away. I did not return to the motel. I merged onto the interstate and drove directly into the heart of the financial district. My destination was a towering skyscraper of steel and glass housing the most ruthless corporate law firm in the state. I parked in the underground garage and rode the private elevator up to the penthouse level. The receptionist recognized me immediately and nodded, bypassing the waiting area to escort me directly to the corner office. Thomas Reed was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk reviewing a stack of contracts. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who charged $1,000 an hour to dismantle corporations. He looked up as I entered and closed his file. "I take it the eviction went exactly as we anticipated?" Thomas asked, motioning for me to sit down. I pulled the restraining order from my jacket and tossed it onto the center of his desk. "They escalated," I said. "Abigail filed an emergency injunction. She claimed I have early onset dementia and violent tendencies. She is using Leo as a human shield." Thomas picked up the document, his sharp eyes scanning the affidavit. He did not look surprised. He looked disappointed in their predictability. "This is sloppy," he murmured. "She filed this under oath. She has handed us perjury on a silver platter. Should I file the motion to dismiss? We can have this thrown out by Friday morning." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of his desk. "No. Let them think the order is airtight. Let them think they have successfully neutralized me. When people believe they are untouchable, they make careless mistakes. Have you prepared the documents regarding the patent ownership?" Thomas opened a secured drawer and pulled out a thick black folder. The original copyright filings from 10 years ago. The core algorithmic framework that Jordan's entire company is built upon. It is fully registered in your name, Kenneth. You granted him a temporary non-exclusive license to use the code, and the acquisition I asked. Thomas smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Jordan is in the final stages of selling his startup to Apex Global for $100 million. The due diligence phase concludes this week. Jordan told them he owns the intellectual property free and clear. In order to finalize the sale, he had to provide a signed transfer of rights from you." I sat back in my chair. "I never signed a transfer of rights." Thomas flipped open the black folder and pushed a scanned document toward me. "Then you will find this particularly interesting. Jordan submitted this to Apex Global 2 days ago. It is a full relinquishment of the patent transferring all proprietary rights to his holding company." I looked at the bottom of the page. My signature was perfectly forged in blue ink. I stared at the strokes of the pen. I had taught that boy how to write. I sat with him at the kitchen table for hours when he was 7 years old, guiding his hand so he could write his own name on his homework. Now he was using that same hand to steal my identity. Jordan had not just been disrespectful. He had committed a federal crime. He had forged my signature to steal my life's work and sell it for $100 million. He was willing to risk federal prison for a payout, assuming I would remain the quiet, subservient father who would never check the legal filings. "We can take this to the district attorney right now," Thomas said, his voice lowering to a serious pitch. "We can have Jordan arrested for felony forgery and fraud before lunchtime. The acquisition will instantly collapse." "No," I said softly, the cold clarity hardening into something much darker. "If we arrest him now, he will play the victim. He will claim it was a misunderstanding. I do not want him to just go to jail. I want him to watch everything he values crumble in his hands first. I want him to feel the exact moment the floor gives out beneath him." "What is your instruction, Kenneth?" "We wait until the Apex Global executives gather for the final signing party. Let Jordan taste the victory. Let him hold the pen. Then you will send the original unaltered patent directly to the legal department of Apex Global. You will inform them that their $100 million acquisition is based on stolen property." Thomas nodded slowly, making a note on his legal pad. "It will obliterate the deal. His company will be utterly worthless overnight. He will be millions of dollars in debt from the legal fallout alone. Make the preparation, Thomas. I stood up, buttoning my coat. Jordan wanted to auction me off for $2. Now we are going to show him what he is really worth. I stepped out of the skyscraper and into the bustling Chicago afternoon. The cold wind whipped past me, but inside my mind was an absolute fortress. Thomas Reed was already setting the legal gears in motion, but there was one piece of physical evidence I needed to secure with my own hands. I drove my old sedan to a highly secure private depository on the north side of the city. I had not visited this vault in nearly a decade. The attendant, a quiet man with silver hair, guided me into the sterile, steel-lined room and left me alone. I inserted my brass key into box number 412. Inside sat a heavy fireproof document sleeve. I pulled it out, carried it to the metal viewing table, and slid the thick parchment free. The official seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights. The document outlined the master algorithm for predictive data routing. This was the exact mathematical foundation that Jordan's entire $100 million company was built upon. He had crafted a pristine, highly marketable narrative for the tech magazines. He sold the media a story of a young, relentless prodigy coding his way to millions in a cramped college dorm room. The reality was vastly different. The reality was a tired, aging father working the graveyard shift at a regional server farm, coming home to a sweltering garage to write complex lines of code until his vision blurred. I had built this architecture from scratch. I had paid the filing fees with money I should have spent on a new winter coat. I did it because I believed in his potential. I had granted him a temporary, non-exclusive license to use the code to launch his startup. It was the inheritance I had intended to give my son freely. Now sitting in the cold vault, I ran my hand over the raised seal. This piece of paper was not just intellectual property anymore. It was the weapon that would dismantle his empire. I placed the document into a secure briefcase and drove straight back to the law firm. Thomas was waiting for me in his conference room, surrounded by stacks of financial disclosures and corporate filings. He had spent the last 2 hours tearing into the public records of Jordan's startup. "Have a seat," Kenneth Thomas said, his tone devoid of its usual aggressive energy. He looked genuinely disturbed. "It is worse than we thought." I pulled the acquisition filings for the Apex Global deal. I sat down and opened my briefcase, placing the original patent on the glass table. What did he do? Thomas pushed a thick binder toward me. To sell the company to Apex, Jordan needed to prove absolute ownership of the core technology. Since he only had a user license from you, he fabricated a complete chain of custody. He did not just forge your signature on a standard transfer agreement. He created a fraudulent shell corporation in Delaware. He drafted fake emails between you and his legal team. He even bribed a notary public to stamp the forged documents, making them look completely legitimate to the Apex auditors. He engineered a massive, premeditated federal fraud. I stared at the fake emails printed in the binder. The language was cold and transactional, supposedly written by me relinquishing my life's work for a symbolic sum of $10. The sheer arrogance of the fabrication was breathtaking. Jordan truly believed I was too ignorant, too passive, and too old to ever uncover his white-collar crimes. He assumed I would spend my final days sitting quietly in the guest house, grateful for the crumbs he threw at me, completely unaware that he had stolen my identity to secure a $100 million payout. "The penalty for this level of wire fraud and forgery is severe," Thomas explained, leaning back in his leather chair. "If we hand this binder over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Jordan is looking at a minimum of 10 to 15 years in federal prison. Apex Global will walk away immediately, and the federal government will seize every asset he owns." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of the law firm. The city skyline stretched out below us, a grid of wealth and ambition. Jordan was out there right now, likely tasting his victory. If I called the authorities, he would be arrested quietly. He would hire expensive defense attorneys. He would play the victim, claiming his elderly father was confused or vindictive. I did not want a quiet arrest. I wanted a public execution of his ego. I wanted him to lose his power in front of the very people he had tried so hard to impress. "We are not calling the federal authorities yet," I said, turning back to Thomas. "We are going to let him step into the trap completely. When is the exact moment of the signing?" Thomas checked his digital calendar. "The Apex Global executives are hosting a formal signing ceremony this Friday at 10 in the morning. It is a massive media event. They are doing it in their penthouse boardroom. Jordan has invited major tech journalists, industry leaders, and of course his wife Abigail. They are treating it like a coronation." Over the next 48 hours, I stayed in my modest hotel room and watched the media spectacle unfold. Jordan was everywhere. He gave an arrogant hour-long interview to a major financial network wearing a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my first car. He boasted about his visionary leadership, his unmatched intellect, and his self-made success. He did not mention my name once. He painted himself as a lone genius who had conquered the digital landscape through sheer willpower. Abigail was equally insufferable. She posted endless updates on her social media accounts showing off diamond jewelry bought on credit, touring luxury vacation homes in Aspen, and bragging about her impending status as the wife of a centimillionaire. They were spending money they did not have, securing massive personal loans against the guarantee of the Apex acquisition. They were gorging themselves on a feast of borrowed money, completely blind to the poison in the food. I felt no anger as I watched them. Anger is an unpredictable emotion. It makes you careless. I felt only the terrifying calm of a man who has calculated every variable. I was watching a demolition perfectly rigged with explosives, just waiting to press the detonator. Friday morning arrived with cold, sharp sunlight piercing the Chicago skyline. I sat at the small desk in my hotel room, my phone resting beside a cup of black coffee. At 9:45, the screen lit up. It was Thomas. "The targets are in the building," Thomas reported, his voice tight with anticipation. Jordan and Abigail just walked into the Apex Global lobby. They have a trailing camera crew. They are heading up the private elevator to the executive boardroom. The Apex legal team is already seated. The champagne is literally on ice. I picked up the phone and looked at the physical patent resting on my desk. The paper was crisp, the ink undeniable. I thought about the charity gala. I thought about the laughter of 500 people echoing in the ballroom as my son tried to sell me for $2. I thought about the restraining order keeping me from my grandson Leo. "Do you have the digital package ready?" I asked. "Everything is loaded," Thomas replied. "The forensic analysis, the original patent scans, and the cease and desist order. It is addressed directly to the Chief Executive Officer and the General Counsel of Apex Global." I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the heavy burden of my past finally lifting off my shoulders. "Send it," I commanded. Thomas hit the key. The hidden patent was no longer hidden. The missile was officially in the air, flying straight toward the glass walls of the Apex boardroom. Jordan was about to find out exactly what happens when you steal from the architect. The penthouse boardroom of Apex Global offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, but all eyes were on the massive mahogany table in the center of the room. Jordan sat at the head of the table, flanked by his legal team and Abigail. She was wearing a perfectly tailored white suit, already posing for the tech journalists gathered near the glass doors. The Chief Executive Officer of Apex Global stood beside Jordan, holding a silver tray with 2 crystal flutes of champagne. The mood was electric, filled with the arrogant certainty of a $100 million victory. The final acquisition contract, a stack of heavy paper bound in leather, rested directly in front of my son. Jordan picked up the solid gold fountain pen provided by his hosts. He smiled for the cameras, hovering the gold tip just inches above the signature line. He was 3 seconds away from becoming a man of unimaginable wealth. Then a sharp, repetitive chime broke the silence. It came from the laptop of the Apex General Counsel, a severe woman sitting at the opposite end of the table. She frowned, tapping her trackpad. The room ignored her, the photographers adjusting their lenses to capture Jordan's historic moment. Jordan pressed the pen to the paper. "Stop," the General Counsel commanded. Her voice was not loud, but it carried an authority that instantly froze the entire room. Jordan paused, looking up with a forced, irritated smile. "Is there a problem? We are right in the middle of the photo op." The General Counsel did not look at the cameras. She stared directly at her screen, her face draining of all color. She stood up, grabbed her laptop, and walked rapidly to the Chief Executive Officer. She turned the screen toward him, shielding it from the press. I could not see their faces from my hotel room, but I knew exactly what they were looking at. They were looking at a high-resolution scan of my original copyright filing. They were looking at a forensic breakdown of the fraudulent shell corporation Jordan had used to launder the intellectual property. And most importantly, they were looking at the undeniable proof that my signature on the transfer agreement was a complete forgery. The Chief Executive Officer read the screen for 10 agonizing seconds. When he finally looked up, his expression had transformed from celebratory warmth to absolute freezing contempt. He placed his champagne flute back on the silver tray with a loud ringing clatter. "Clear the room," he ordered, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "I want the press out, now." The security detail moved immediately, ushering the confused journalists and photographers out the heavy double doors. Abigail stood up, her perfectly rehearsed smile faltering. "What is going on? We were about to sign." The Chief Executive Officer ignored her. He looked down at Jordan, who was still holding the gold pen. "You represented to this board that you had sole and absolute ownership of the predictive routing algorithm. You provided sworn affidavits and a notarized transfer of rights." "I do own it," Jordan said, his voice tightening with a sudden creeping panic. "My legal team cleared every hurdle. The chain of custody is flawless." The general counsel turned the laptop around and shoved it across the mahogany table. It slid and stopped right in front of Jordan. The screen displayed the cease and desist order drafted by Thomas Reed, complete with the forensic signature analysis. "Your chain of custody is a federal crime," the general counsel said, her tone dripping with professional disgust. "We just received an emergency injunction from the original patent holder. The transfer document you provided us is a forgery. You do not own the core technology of your own company. You own a stolen license." Jordan stared at the screen. For a moment, his arrogant facade completely shattered, revealing the terrified little boy hiding underneath. He recognized the name of the law firm representing the claimant. He knew I had finally struck back. But he was too deep into his own lies to confess. He slammed his hand on the table, attempting to project righteous anger. "This is absurd. This is a shakedown by a disgruntled former employee. My father is not mentally sound. He has a restraining order against him. I can clear this up with one phone call." "You are not making any phone calls from this building," the chief executive officer said, stepping back from the table as if Jordan had suddenly become infectious. "Apex Global has a zero-tolerance policy for intellectual property fraud. We are terminating the acquisition immediately. Our legal department is forwarding these documents to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I suggest you retain a very expensive criminal defense attorney." The boardroom descended into chaos. Jordan's own lawyers began packing their briefcases, frantically refusing to make eye contact with him. They knew that if they were implicated in submitting forged documents to a buyer, they would be disbarred and prosecuted. They abandoned him right there at the table. Abigail grabbed Jordan's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "Jordan, tell them they are wrong. Fix this. Fix it right now." But Jordan could not fix it. The security guards approached the table, standing over my son and my daughter-in-law. They were instructed to escort them out through the freight elevator, ensuring they bypassed the lobby entirely. The golden boy of the tech world was being thrown out with the garbage. The fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. By the time Jordan and Abigail reached their Range Rover in the underground parking garage, the news had already leaked to the financial networks. Apex Global kills $100 million acquisition amid allegations of massive patent fraud. The headline flashed across terminals in every major trading floor. Jordan sat behind the steering wheel of his car, his hands gripping the leather so tightly his knuckles turned white. His phone began vibrating relentlessly in the center console. Abigail snatched the phone. "It is the bank," she screamed, staring at the incoming caller identification. "It is the bank that issued our personal bridge loan. Jordan, we borrowed $5 million against the Apex payout to buy the Aspen property. We put up your company shares as collateral." Jordan snatched the phone back and threw it into the back seat. He leaned his head against the steering wheel, his breathing shallow and rapid. He remembered a night many years ago, back when he was a teenager. He had tried to cheat on a state math exam by altering a single digit on his report card. I had caught him immediately. I did not yell. I simply sat him down at the kitchen table and explained how the architecture of a lie always collapses under its own weight. I told him that I paid attention to the details everyone else ignored. He had rolled his eyes at me, then calling me a dinosaur who did not understand how the real world worked. He had spent his entire adult life underestimating my intelligence, confusing my quiet patience for weakness. Now, sitting in the dark garage, the reality of my meticulous nature finally crushed him. He realized I had not just kept the patent. I had watched him build his entire fraudulent empire on my foundation, waiting for the exact moment the stakes were highest to pull the support beam out from under him. "What are we going to do?" Abigail demanded, her voice shrill with genuine terror. "My credit cards are tied to the company accounts. If the board finds out you lied about the patent, they will freeze everything. We have to find your father. We have to force him to retract that email. You have the restraining order. Use it. Threaten to have him locked up." Jordan started the engine, the roar of the exhaust echoing off the concrete walls. "You do not understand," he muttered, shifting the car into gear. "He is using a corporate law firm. He is not hiding in some cheap motel. He planned this. He has been planning this since the night of the gala." "We will find him," Abigail sneered. "He is just a bitter old man. He cannot hide from us." They sped out of the garage, leaving black tire marks on the pavement, desperately racing back to their mansion to strategize. They had no idea that they were completely broke. While they were driving, the board of directors at Jordan's startup convened an emergency remote meeting. Within 30 minutes of the Apex deal collapsing, they voted unanimously to suspend Jordan as chief executive officer pending an internal investigation into the forgery. They locked him out of his corporate email. They froze his company credit cards. They severed his access to the operational accounts. The multi-million-dollar empire Jordan had built was gone, vanishing like smoke in a windstorm. He was no longer a visionary leader. He was an unemployed liability carrying massive personal debt. The first cut had been delivered flawlessly, slicing straight through the financial artery that kept his arrogance alive. To save himself from federal prison and total bankruptcy, Jordan now had only one option left. He had to find the father he had discarded, get on his knees, and beg for mercy. He hired the most expensive private investigator in Chicago to track down my location. He expected to find me huddled in a crumbling apartment on the outskirts of the city. He was about to walk into a reality that would break his mind entirely. The private investigator charged Jordan $10,000 for a 3-hour rush job. He handed Jordan a sealed envelope containing my current address and walked away into the Chicago crowds without saying a single word. Jordan and Abigail tore open the heavy paper envelope while sitting in their parked Range Rover, their hands shaking with a mixture of rage and sheer desperation. They fully expected to see an address located deep in the industrial district, a decaying apartment complex with broken windows, or perhaps a budget motel on the far outskirts of the city. Instead, the printed coordinates directed them to the Zenith Tower, the most exclusive and heavily guarded residential skyscraper in downtown Chicago. They drove the distance in stunned, heavy silence. They pulled up to a magnificent glass entryway where the valets wore tailored suits and the sweeping lobby was lined with imported Italian marble. Jordan approached the concierge desk, adjusting his wrinkled jacket, fully expecting to be told that no one named Kenneth Washington lived on the premises. Instead, the concierge checked his digital tablet, nodded politely, and handed Jordan a temporary magnetic keycard. The card was pre-authorized for the private penthouse elevator. I had explicitly instructed the front desk to let them up the moment they arrived. I knew they were coming. The elevator doors slid open on the 75th floor, revealing a private foyer illuminated by a crystal chandelier that led directly into a sprawling $10 million penthouse. Jordan and Abigail stepped cautiously onto the rich Brazilian hardwood floors. Their eyes darted nervously across the massive, echoing space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed, breathtaking view of Lake Michigan, the water glittering under the afternoon sun. Expensive modern art hung on the pristine white walls, and a grand piano sat quietly in the corner of a living room that was larger than the entire first floor of their mansion. They found me sitting calmly at a custom marble dining table, drinking a cup of dark espresso. I was not wearing my worn-out flannel shirts or the faded denim jeans they were so accustomed to seeing. I was wearing a tailored cashmere sweater and a vintage gold Rolex watch that I had bought for myself 20 years ago but had never once worn in front of them. The visual contrast was physically jarring for them. Jordan literally stumbled over his own feet, his brain completely failing to process the reality of the wealth standing right in front of him. "Dad," Jordan whispered. His voice cracked with disbelief as he looked around the magnificent room. "Whose place is this? How are you here?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso. "It is my place, Jordan. I bought it in cash 5 years ago." Abigail gripped the leather strap of her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles popped audibly. "That is completely impossible," she blurted out, unable to contain her shock and rising panic. "You worked graveyard shifts at a regional server farm. You begged us to live in that tiny guest house." I set my cup down gently on the matching marble coaster. "I did not beg you for anything. I built that guest house entirely with my own money to inflate your overall property value so your commercial bank would finally approve your startup loan. I worked at the server farm when Jordan was a child to keep food on the table and pay for his early education, yes. But software engineers who build foundational algorithms do not stay poor, Abigail. I sold 3 minor software patents before Jordan even graduated high school. I invested the capital aggressively. I compounded it silently over 2 decades. I chose to live simply because I valued peace over performative wealth. I wanted to stay close to my grandson. I wanted to see if my own son would treat me with basic human respect if he thought I had absolutely nothing to offer him but my presence. You both failed that test spectacularly. The color completely drained from Jordan's face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He realized the terrifying magnitude of his mistake. He had not just insulted an old, helpless man. He had declared war on a ghost who held all the financial and legal cards, a man who possessed far more wealth and power than he ever did. The immense arrogance that had defined him just 24 hours ago vanished completely. It was replaced by the pathetic, sniveling desperation of a cornered animal realizing the trap is lethal. He crossed the expansive room rapidly and dropped to his knees right beside my marble table. He reached out and grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly as if I were his only lifeline. "Dad, please," Jordan cried. Genuine tears began streaming down his face, ruining his carefully curated image. "I am so sorry. I lost my mind." The pressure of the company, the demands from the investors, the media attention, it completely broke me. "I never meant to hurt you. You have to believe me. We are family. You cannot let them send me to federal prison." The board suspended me. They froze my accounts. "We are going to lose everything we have. Just retract the email you sent to Apex Global. Tell them it was a misunderstanding over the license. I will give you whatever you want. I will give you half the company ownership." Abigail rushed forward, her previous venom and superiority entirely neutralized by the overwhelming sight of my undeniable wealth. She kneeled right next to him on the expensive rug, her voice dripping with artificial, sickening sweetness. "Kenneth, we were so incredibly wrong. I was stressed. I was overly protective of Leo, but I was completely out of line. If you fix this, if you save Jordan's company today, I will call the judge right now. I will drop the emergency restraining order immediately. You can see Leo every single day. He asks about you all the time. He misses his grandfather. We can go back to being a family. Just please sign the retraction document." I looked down at the two of them kneeling on my imported rug, begging for their financial lives. It was a pathetic display of hollow submission. They were not sorry for what they had done to me at the gala. They were not sorry for kicking me out into the cold night. They were only sorry that the trap had snapped shut on their own legs. I gently but firmly pulled my hand out of Jordan's desperate grip. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen once and placed it flat on the table. "2 nights ago, when you stormed into the guest house to evict me, you thought I was thoroughly defeated," I said, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any sympathy. "You thought I was just an old man packing my bags in terror. But you continually forget that I am an engineer. I installed a continuous audio sync security camera in the ceiling fixture of that guest house 2 years ago. I did not do it to spy on you, but to protect my own personal space. It kept recording long after I walked out the door and drove away." I pressed play on the screen. The audio was crystal clear, capturing the exact conversation Jordan and Abigail had immediately after I left the property. Abigail's recorded voice hissed through the phone speaker. "Did you see his face? Pathetic. We should have done this a year ago." Jordan's recorded voice responded cold and entirely indifferent. "It does not matter now. Tomorrow I will have the lawyer draft a formal declaration of his incompetence. We will push him into a state-funded nursing home. If he resists, we use the restraining order to have him committed to a psychiatric ward. Once he is locked up, the state handles his expenses and we never have to deal with him again. I am not letting that dinosaur ruin my $100 million payout." I paused the recording. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, deafening, and incredibly heavy. Jordan stared at the dark screen of the phone, his mouth opening and closing repeatedly without producing a single sound. He was completely paralyzed by the undeniable proof of his own malice. Abigail looked down at the floor, the fake mask of the loving daughter-in-law completely ripped away, exposing the rotting, selfish core of her true character. I stood up from the table, towering over them as they remained on their knees. "You did not want a family," I said quietly, letting the words sink into their skin. "You wanted a victim. You wanted a silent asset you could liquidate, exploit, and then discard when it became inconvenient. And when your plan encountered slight resistance, you tried to use my innocent grandson as a bargaining chip to extort a forgery retraction." I pointed a steady finger toward the heavy oak doors of the foyer. "Get out of my house." Jordan tried to speak, to formulate one last desperate lie to save his sinking ship, but the icy look in my eyes stopped him dead in his tracks. He scrambled clumsily to his feet, pulling Abigail up with him. They backed away slowly, genuinely terrified of the man they had created through their own cruelty, before turning and fleeing rapidly into the elevator. As the doors slid closed, I sat back down and finished my espresso. I knew exactly what Jordan would do next. Cornered, broke, and facing imminent federal prison, he would abandon all logic. He would try to find the physical original patent document to destroy the primary evidence against him. and I had already prepared the perfect isolated place for him to look. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse watching Jordan and Abigail flee the Zenith Tower. Their Range Rover sped out of the pristine valet driveway and merged recklessly into the heavy Chicago traffic, looking like a tiny panicked insect navigating the concrete grid below. They were running away from the reality of my wealth, but they could not run away from the consequences of their own actions. I turned away from the glass, walked over to my marble dining table, and picked up my smartphone. I dialed Thomas Reed. The line clicked open on the first ring. They took the bait. I said, my voice perfectly steady in the quiet expanse of the penthouse. They know they cannot fight the federal forgery charges legally. Jordan is terrified. He is going to try to destroy the physical evidence before the authorities can execute a search warrant. Thomas let out a low, knowing chuckle on the other end of the line. The South Side facility is fully prepped, Kenneth. My private security contractors finished the modifications an hour ago. The perimeter alarm system has been intentionally downgraded just as you requested. The exterior floodlights are disabled, and the heavy commercial lock on the side alley door has been replaced with a standard, easily bypassable deadbolt. Do you really think he is foolish enough to commit a physical felony tonight? Desperation breeds profound stupidity. Thomas, I replied, taking a final sip of my espresso. He has lost his company, his investors, and his pristine public image. He is staring down a massive prison sentence. He will abandon his polished executive persona and revert to raw survival instinct. He will be at the warehouse by midnight. I knew my son better than he knew himself. Jordan needed the original patent, the document bearing my genuine signature, to burn it into ashes. If the physical proof of the forgery vanished, his high-priced defense attorneys could argue that the digital copies Apex Global received were merely fabricated files sent by a disgruntled family member. He desperately needed to find where I kept my most valuable physical assets, and he already knew exactly where to look. I bought the brick industrial warehouse on the south side of Chicago almost 30 years ago. Back then it was just a damp, drafty shell with a leaking roof and shattered windows. I spent my weekends and late nights in that building soldering circuit boards, writing endless lines of code, and building the very first server racks that would eventually house the predictive routing algorithm. When Jordan was a teenager, he absolutely hated that building. He called it a filthy junkyard. He was deeply embarrassed that his father spent his Friday nights covered in grease and copper wire, while the other fathers at his elite private school were playing golf or attending expensive country club dinners. He never understood that the grease on my hands and the wire on my workbenches were paying for his exorbitant tuition. He viewed my labor with disgust. Now that same junkyard was the only place he could think of that might hold his salvation. I had casually mentioned the warehouse to Abigail several months ago, deliberately planting the seed that I stored all my old legal and financial files in a safe on the premises. I knew she would remind him the moment they panicked. At 11:45 that night, while I sat comfortably on my leather sofa reading a book, a silent notification flashed across the screen of my tablet. The perimeter motion sensors at the warehouse had been tripped. Jordan had arrived. I opened the secure application on my tablet, and the high-definition feeds from the hidden interior cameras flickered to life. I watched my son step into the frame. The arrogant, self-proclaimed tech visionary was now reduced to a common sneaking burglar. He was dressed entirely in black, gripping a heavy iron crowbar in his gloved hands. He slinked through the weed-choked alleyway, his head darting back and forth in pure paranoia. He approached the side entrance. He wedged the crowbar between the steel door and the frame, leaning his entire body weight into the metal handle. Jordan was not a physical man. He had spent his entire life sitting in ergonomic chairs behind expensive desks, delegating heavy lifting to others. Watching him struggle with the door was a pathetic display of physical inadequacy. But fear gave him a surge of adrenaline. The intentionally weakened deadbolt snapped with a sharp, violent crack that echoed through the empty alley. Jordan slipped inside, pulling the heavy steel door shut behind him. The interior of the warehouse was pitch black. Jordan clicked on a heavy tactical flashlight. The narrow, blinding beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the rows of dusty, obsolete server racks and heavy workbenches. He moved quickly past the monuments of my past labor, his breathing heavy and erratic. He was making a tremendous amount of noise, his expensive boots echoing loudly against the concrete floor. He was driven by pure, blinding panic. He made his way directly to the back office, a small glass-enclosed room where I used to draft my engineering blueprints. He kicked the office door open, shattering the old glass pane. The beam of his flashlight immediately hit the target I had left for him right in the center of the room. It was a massive vintage steel safe bolted directly to the concrete floor beneath my old wooden desk. Jordan threw his crowbar onto the desk and unzipped a heavy canvas duffel bag he had slung over his shoulder. He pulled out a cordless industrial-grade angle grinder. He was fully prepared to tear the heavy steel apart by brute force. He plugged a high-capacity battery into the grinder, the high-pitched whine of the blade slicing aggressively through the quiet warehouse. Sparks flew violently across the dark room as he pressed the spinning blade directly against the thick steel hinges of the safe. He worked frantically for 20 agonizing minutes. His face was covered in a thick layer of sweat and metallic dust. He was destroying his soft hands, pushing the heavy tool far beyond its limits, driven solely by the absolute terror of impending federal prison time. The grinder whined and smoked the battery, nearly dying, but finally the top hinge gave way with a loud metallic groan. He dropped the smoking grinder, grabbed the crowbar, wedged it deep into the weakened gap, and wrenched the heavy steel door open with a guttural, desperate scream of effort. He dropped the crowbar and fell to his knees in front of the open safe. Inside the dark cavity rested a single thick manila envelope. Across the front of the envelope, written in my unmistakable handwriting, was the exact patent registration number for the predictive routing algorithm. Jordan let out a ragged, hysterical gasp of profound relief. He grabbed the envelope, clutching it tightly to his chest as if it were a life preserver in a freezing, turbulent ocean. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed he had outsmarted the old man one final time. He stood up slowly, wiping the mixture of sweat and grime from his forehead, a twisted, arrogant smile of absolute triumph breaking across his face. He did not wait to get back to his car. He wanted the immense satisfaction of destroying the evidence immediately. He set his flashlight on the desk, illuminating the workspace. He pulled a silver cigarette lighter from his pocket, flicked the flame alive, and tore open the heavy paper flap of the manila envelope. He reached inside to pull out the thick parchment paper. Instead, his fingers brushed against a cold, hard block of heavy plastic. He frowned, his victorious smile faltering instantly. He lowered the lighter and tipped the envelope upside down. The contents slid out and hit my dusty wooden desk with a heavy, solid thud. It was not a stack of legal documents. It was a solid block of industrial steel. Firmly glued to the top of the steel block was a small, state-of-the-art micro camera. The high-definition lens was pointed directly up at his face. A tiny bright red LED light was blinking steadily, confirming that it was actively recording and transmitting a live feed directly to a secure cloud server. Resting right next to the camera was an active GPS tracking beacon glowing with a soft green light. Jordan stared at the blinking red light. The silver lighter slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the concrete floor. The horrific, suffocating realization washed over him in a freezing wave. There was no patent here. There was never a patent in this building. He had just been recorded committing felony breaking and entering, severe destruction of private property, and attempted theft of corporate documents. And he had done it all while carrying a deadly weapon actively under investigation for massive intellectual property fraud. Before he could even turn around to run toward the broken door, the dark warehouse was suddenly flooded with blinding, piercing light. Intense red and blue strobes reflected aggressively off the dusty industrial windows. The deafening wail of multiple police sirens completely shattered the silence of the night, the heavy vehicles screeching to a violent halt directly outside the alley door he had just destroyed. Heavy fists began pounding on the steel. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had crushed him entirely. Jordan was detained by the Chicago Police Department at the warehouse, but the charges filed that night were surprisingly light. His high-priced defense attorney, a man who specialized in making wealthy people's problems disappear, arrived at the precinct before dawn. He argued successfully that the broken door was merely a civil property dispute between an estranged father and son, completely devoid of criminal intent. By sunrise, Jordan had posted bail for misdemeanor trespassing and walked out into the freezing morning air, exhausted, covered in metallic dust, but temporarily free. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted me again. He thought the worst was behind him, and that he had bought himself at least a few months to mount a complex legal defense. He did not realize that the local police were completely unaware of the larger scheme. Thomas Reed and I had anticipated this exact legal maneuver. We wanted him out on bail. We wanted him comfortable and dangerously overconfident. We did not give the local authorities the micro-camera footage or the forged Apex Global contracts. We bypassed the local district attorney entirely and handed the complete digital package directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal agents were quietly assembling a sealed grand jury indictment for massive corporate fraud, waiting for the perfect, most devastatingly public moment to execute the warrant. Despite the catastrophic collapse of the Apex acquisition and his sudden suspension as chief executive officer, Abigail absolutely refused to cancel her highly publicized charity gala scheduled for that very evening. The event was titled the Future Innovators Foundation Gala, hosted at the grand atrium of the Field Museum. Canceling the event would be a public admission of defeat. It would signal imminent financial ruin to their creditors and the ruthless Chicago elite. Abigail was a woman who worshipped optics above all else. She operated on the delusion that if she simply projected an image of untouchable wealth, the underlying reality would magically fix itself. She forced Jordan into a freshly pressed tuxedo, covering his bruised, trembling hands with expensive silk cuffs. She rented out the entire museum floor, filling the grand hall with towering arrangements of white orchids and hiring a classical string quartet. She was desperate to secure emergency bridge loans from the oblivious billionaires in attendance, hoping to float their massive lifestyle for just one more month. She smiled at the cameras, completely blind to the fact that she was actively decorating her own financial grave. I remember when Jordan was a junior in high school. He failed a crucial science fair project because he stubbornly refused to follow the basic laws of physics. Instead of building a functional, mathematically sound circuit board, he opted for a flashy, impossible presentation constructed out of expensive acrylic and imported lights. When the judges plugged it in, it immediately short-circuited and caught fire. He always believed that if something looked spectacular enough on the surface, people would completely ignore the structural flaws underneath. He blamed the judges for lacking vision rather than accepting his own failure. Abigail shared this exact same fundamental flaw. They were two arrogant architects building a massive castle on a foundation soaked in gasoline, and they were currently hosting a spectacular party while actively holding the lit match. I was not formally invited to this gala, of course, but I did not need to be there in person. Thomas Reed and I sat comfortably in his secure corner office, watching the high-definition live stream of the event on his large monitor, flanked by a silent federal prosecutor who was simply waiting for my final green light. The event was in full swing by 8 o'clock. The museum atrium was packed with 500 of the wealthiest tech moguls, real estate developers, and influential socialites in the city. These were the very same people who had laughed at me when Jordan auctioned me off for $2. Now they were eating expensive caviar and bidding on silent auction items, completely oblivious to the impending storm. Abigail stepped up to the grand podium, bathed in brilliant stage lights. She wore a stunning emerald gown, diamonds glittering brightly at her throat. She began delivering a tearful, hypocritical speech about integrity, the absolute importance of family values, and paving the way for the youth of tomorrow. It was a masterclass in sociopathic deception. Jordan stood rigidly right beside the podium. He was sweating profusely under the bright lights, his eyes darting nervously across the crowded room, clutching a glass of whiskey as if his life depended on it. The ice clinked loudly against the crystal glass, betraying his severe internal tremors. The elite crowd clapped politely, completely unaware of the massive financial crimes hovering right above the couple. Then the heavy brass doors of the museum atrium swung open with a violent, echoing thud. The people entering were not late guests, and they were not local police officers. It was a tactical team of 12 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across their backs. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly, a harsh screech of a bow dragging across a cello slicing through the elegant room. The polite applause died instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, murmuring in confusion and sudden, sharp alarm. Men in expensive suits instinctively stepped back, not wanting to be caught in the blast radius of whatever was about to happen. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a completely emotionless expression, walked directly down the center aisle. He did not pause to admire the dinosaur exhibits. He did not wait for Abigail to finish her carefully rehearsed speech. He marched straight up the carpeted stairs and stepped directly onto the main stage. Jordan tried to back away, his whiskey glass slipping from his trembling fingers and shattering loudly against the wooden stage. His artificial bravado completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified boy who finally realized he could not lie his way out of the consequences. The lead agent pulled a thick, folded federal warrant from his jacket and spoke directly to Jordan, his voice loud and commanding enough for the podium microphone to broadcast across the entire silent museum. Jordan Washington, You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, felony forgery in connection with the Apex Global Acquisition and interstate corporate espionage. You have the right to remain silent." Abigail shrieked a piercing, ugly sound that entirely destroyed her elegant facade. She stepped in front of the agent, slapping her hands frantically against his chest, screaming that they were making a mistake, demanding they leave, and desperately citing her elite social standing. The federal agent did not even blink. He smoothly sidestepped, grabbed Jordan by the shoulder, spun him around roughly, and snapped cold, heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the massive acoustic dome of the museum. It was the absolute sweetest sound I had ever heard. The society photographers, originally hired by Abigail at great expense to capture her glorious triumph, immediately turned their professional lenses toward the stage. Flashbulbs erupted like a violent lightning storm, blinding the room. They frantically captured the golden boy of the tech world, the self-proclaimed visionary being perp-walked off his own stage in chains. The elite circle they had sacrificed my dignity to impress was now watching them fall in absolute, undeniable disgrace. The whispers ripping through the crowd were vicious and immediate. Investors were already pulling out their phones, frantically calling their financial brokers to dump any remaining stock associated with Jordan's ruined name. The social execution was flawless, brutal, and entirely public. As the armed agents marched Jordan down the center aisle toward the flashing lights of the federal vehicles waiting outside, he looked back over his shoulder, searching wildly for a lifeline. He locked eyes with Abigail, silently begging her to call their lawyers, begging her to stand loyally by his side. But Abigail did not reach out to comfort him. She did not follow him down the stairs to the vehicles. She stood frozen on the stage, the terrifying realization of complete asset seizure hitting her like a speeding freight train. She knew that if Jordan went down for federal fraud, the government would execute a total freeze on all assets connected to the crime by midnight. The massive mansion, the luxury cars, and the offshore bank accounts would all be seized immediately. She watched the black SUV drive away, leaving her stranded in a room full of people who were actively laughing at her downfall. She pulled her smartphone out, stepping quickly into the dark shadows behind the stage curtains. She did not call a high-powered defense lawyer to help her husband. She did not call a bail bondsman. Back in the secure law firm, Thomas Reed's private desk phone began to ring loudly. The caller identification flashed brightly in the dim room. He looked up at me, picked up the receiver, and smiled a slow, predatory smile. It was Abigail. The ship was fully sinking, and the rats were preparing to eat each other to survive. Thomas Reed held the receiver of his private desk phone out to me, his sharp eyes gleaming with predatory amusement. He covered the mouthpiece with his hand. "It is Abigail," he whispered. "She sounds like she is hyperventilating. She is demanding to speak with you immediately." I took the phone and pressed it to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply let the dead silence stretch across the line, forcing her to speak first. "Kenneth," she breathed, her voice trembling with a frantic, chaotic energy. "I know you are listening. You saw what just happened. The federal agents took him. They are already locking down the company accounts, and my personal banker just texted me that my platinum cards have been frozen. You have made your point. You destroyed him. But we both know Jordan is going to fight this. He is going to hire an army of defense attorneys and drag this out for years. I have something that will guarantee he never sees the outside of a prison cell again." "And what makes you think I need your help?" I asked, my voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. "Because Jordan is careful," she snapped back, her desperation making her bold. "He wiped his primary servers. He destroyed the physical drives in his home office the second the Apex deal collapsed. But he missed a backup. I have it. I want to make a deal. Meet me right now." I looked at Thomas. He gave a slight approving nod. I did not invite her to the law firm, nor did I invite her to my penthouse. I gave her the address of a rundown 24-hour diner located on the industrial edge of the city, a place that smelled of stale grease and bleach. It was an environment designed to strip away every ounce of her artificial superiority. I told her I would be there in 30 minutes and hung up the phone. When I arrived, the diner was mostly empty, save for a tired truck driver asleep in a corner booth and a waitress wiping down the sticky Formica counters. I slid into a vinyl booth beneath a flickering fluorescent light and ordered a cup of black coffee. 15 minutes later, Abigail walked through the glass doors. The visual contrast was absolutely staggering. She was still wearing her custom emerald silk ball gown from the charity Gala, accompanied by a fortune in diamond jewelry. But the immaculate facade was entirely shattered. Her mascara was smeared beneath her eyes, her hair was disheveled from the wind, and she carried her designer handbag clutched to her chest like a shield. She looked like a deposed queen wandering through a wasteland. She slid into the booth across from me, shivering despite the heavy heat radiating from the diner kitchen. She looked around with absolute disgust before fixing her bloodshot eyes on me. "The federal agents are tearing the mansion apart right now," she whispered aggressively, leaning across the table. "They kicked me out. I had to leave in an Uber. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. "You are wearing $250,000 in diamonds while your husband sits in a concrete holding cell. Forgive me if my sympathy is limited. What do you want, Abigail?" She placed her handbag on the table, unclasped the gold latch, and pulled out a small, heavy silver USB drive. She kept her manicured hand firmly pressed over it, ensuring I could not take it. "I am a realist, Kenneth." She began attempting to compose her features into a mask of cold business acumen. "I married Jordan because he was an appreciating asset. I backed his ambitions because I wanted the lifestyle he promised me. But he is a sinking ship now. He committed federal crimes and he was stupid enough to get caught. I absolutely refuse to drown with him. I refuse to be the disgraced wife of a federal inmate living in some tiny apartment and clipping coupons." And the drive I prompted, staring at the silver metal beneath her fingers. "This is the nail in his coffin," she said, a cruel, triumphant smile breaking through her exhaustion. "It contains the encrypted audio logs from his private office. It has the original unedited drafts of the forged Apex transfer documents, complete with the metadata proving Jordan created them on his personal laptop. It also contains the financial records showing exactly how much he bribed the notary public. If the federal prosecutors get this drive, Jordan cannot negotiate a plea deal. He cannot claim ignorance. He goes away for 20 years guaranteed." She paused, waiting for me to show eagerness, waiting for me to validate her leverage. I remained perfectly still. "I will slide this drive across the table to you right now," she continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But in exchange, you are going to wire $5 million into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands that the federal government cannot touch. You are also going to draft a legally binding contract waiving any future civil lawsuits against me regarding the property, and you are going to guarantee that I retain full, uncontested custody of Leo. I get my money, I get my son, and I get a clean break. You get your total revenge." I looked at the woman sitting across from me. She was willing to sell the father of her child to the federal government for $5 million and a clean getaway. She was using her own son as a contractual bargaining chip without a single ounce of maternal hesitation. She genuinely believed that this was a brilliant strategic maneuver. She thought she was playing the game perfectly. "Let me ensure I fully understand your proposal," I said, maintaining a steady conversational volume. "You are currently in possession of critical material evidence regarding a massive federal fraud investigation. You are actively hiding this evidence from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who are currently searching your home. And you are offering to sell me this evidence for $5 million in untraceable funds, effectively extorting me to secure your own financial future." "Yes," she replied, her eyes narrowing, slightly annoyed by my deliberate phrasing. "Do not try to make it sound ugly, Kenneth. It is a business transaction. You have more money than you know what to do with. $5 million is nothing to you. Pay me and you finish him off." I did not reach for the silver drive. Instead, I reached into the interior pocket of my cashmere coat and pulled out a small, sleek digital audio recorder. The red recording light was pulsing steadily, illuminating the dark space between us on the table. Abigail stared at the blinking red light. The smug negotiating confidence completely drained from her face, replaced instantly by raw, paralyzing terror. She pulled her hand back from the USB drive as if the metal had suddenly turned red hot. "What is that?" She choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing?" "I am collecting evidence," I replied calmly, picking up the small silver USB drive she had abandoned on the table. "You see, Abigail Thomas Reed and I do not need this drive to put Jordan in prison. We already handed the federal agents a flawless, airtight package of digital forensics. Jordan was finished the moment the FBI walked through those museum doors tonight. But I did need something else. I needed proof of exactly who you are." I tapped the stop button on the digital recorder. "You just confessed to misprision of a felony," I explained, leaning slightly forward. "You confessed to actively concealing evidence from a federal investigation, and you explicitly attempted to extort me for $5 million. Those are severe criminal offenses, Abigail." She scrambled backward in the vinyl booth, her eyes wide with panic. "You cannot use that. That was a private conversation. You entrapped me." "Illinois is a two-party consent state for recording," I acknowledged smoothly. which means this audio file might be inadmissible in a standard criminal court. However, I have absolutely no intention of giving this recording to the police. I pulled out my smartphone and connected the digital recorder via a small cable. I quickly selected the audio file we had just created. "Then what are you doing with it?" she demanded, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic as she watched my fingers move across the screen. "I am sending it to Jordan's lead defense attorney," I said, hitting the send button and watching the progress bar instantly fill, with explicit instructions to play it for Jordan in his holding cell first thing tomorrow morning. Abigail let out a strangled gasp, pressing her hands against her mouth. "Jordan is currently sitting in a cold cell, terrified and alone," I continued, my voice dropping to a freezing register. "He likely thinks you are out here fighting for him. He likely thinks you are his loyal wife trying to save his empire. Tomorrow morning he will listen to the mother of his child casually sell him out for cash. He will hear you call him a sinking ship. He will realize that the woman he committed federal crimes to impress never loved him at all." "You are a monster," she hissed, tears of genuine panic finally spilling over her eyelashes and ruining the last of her makeup. "No," I corrected her, sliding out of the diner booth and standing over her. "I am simply a mirror. I am reflecting the exact ugliness you both brought into my life. When Jordan hears this recording, he will realize he has absolutely nothing left to protect. He will turn on you, Abigail. He will tell the federal prosecutors exactly how much you knew about the forged patent. He will tell them about your offshore accounts. He will drag you down into the concrete cell right next to his." I dropped a $20 bill on the table to pay for the coffee and walked out of the diner. I did not look back. I stepped into the cool Chicago night air, leaving Abigail sitting alone in her ruined emerald gown under the flickering fluorescent lights, completely paralyzed by the realization that her betrayal had just sealed her own destruction. I woke up the next morning as the sun rose over Lake Michigan, casting a brilliant golden light across the hardwood floors of my penthouse. I brewed a cup of black coffee and turned on the television in the media room. I knew the strict daily timeline of a federal holding cell. By 8 in the morning, Jordan's lead defense attorney would have arrived at the precinct. By 8:15, that attorney would have played the digital audio recording of Abigail selling him out for $5 million. I could only imagine the profound, earth-shattering realization crashing down on my son as he sat in his orange jumpsuit listening to his wife negotiate his 20-year prison sentence. But Abigail was not a woman who waited passively for the axe to fall. She knew Jordan was going to turn on her the second he heard that tape. She needed to establish her defense immediately, and she chose to do it in the only arena she truly understood. She took her fight to the court of public opinion. At 9 o'clock, she appeared live on a prominent national morning news broadcast. She had hired a ruthless crisis management public relations firm overnight, likely promising them a massive cut of her future divorce settlement. Her appearance was meticulously calculated to evoke maximum sympathy. She wore a simple, unbranded beige sweater, her hair pulled back into a modest ponytail. The heavy diamond jewelry was gone, replaced by a bare neck and a wedding ring she continuously twisted with trembling fingers. She sat on the brightly lit studio couch, clutching a tissue, her eyes perfectly red and welling with highly controlled tears. The veteran news anchor leaned forward, projecting deep, manufactured sympathy. "Abigail, your husband was arrested last night by federal agents in front of hundreds of people at your own charity event. How are you holding up?" Abigail took a shaky breath, dabbing her eyes delicately. "I am completely devastated," she whispered, her voice cracking with practiced vulnerability. "I had absolutely no idea what Jordan was doing behind closed doors. He controlled all our finances. He controlled my entire life. I was just trying to be a supportive wife and a good mother to our 3-year-old son, Leo." The anchor pressed gently, reading from a prepared card. "And your father-in-law, Kenneth. He is the one who brought this massive fraud to light. Some reports say he orchestrated the collapse of the Apex Global acquisition." Abigail looked directly into the camera lens, deploying her most venomous lie yet. "Kenneth is a deeply troubled man. He has been suffering from severe cognitive decline and paranoia for years. Jordan and I tried so hard to get him psychiatric help, but he became violent. He developed a vindictive obsession with destroying Jordan out of pure, irrational jealousy. I am terrified of him. I am terrified for my son's safety. Kenneth orchestrated this entire public spectacle because he hates me, and Jordan was simply too weak to stop him." I watched her weave this absolute fiction while sitting in Thomas Reed's office later that afternoon. The news chyrons flashing across the bottom of the screen read, "Tech CEO wife claims abuse and elder harassment." Her performance was incredibly effective. Within hours, social media began to rally behind her. Influencers and commentators praised her bravery for speaking out against toxic family dynamics and financial abuse. A crowdfunding campaign was launched by her supporters to help pay her emergency legal fees and secure housing, raising tens of thousands of dollars in a single afternoon. She was successfully rebranding herself from a disgraced, extravagant socialite into a national symbol of survival. Thomas muted the television, shaking his head in absolute disgust. "She is creating a public legal shield," he said, tapping his silver pen against his heavy desk. "She knows the federal prosecutors watch the news cycle. If she generates enough public sympathy, the district attorney might hesitate to indict her alongside Jordan, fearing a massive media backlash. We need to release a press statement immediately to counter this narrative. We need to remind the public about the forged documents." I looked at the muted screen, watching Abigail wipe away another fake tear as the studio audience applauded her bravery. "No," I replied calmly. "We never interrupt an enemy when they are in the middle of making a fatal mistake." "What mistake?" Thomas asked, frowning slightly. "She is completely winning the news cycle today. The public is eating this up. She is building her pedestal incredibly high," I explained, turning away from the television. "The higher she climbs on this false narrative of victimhood, the more destructive the fall will be when we remove the structural supports. If we release a simple text statement, it becomes a typical he said, she said media argument. We let her talk. We let her go on every talk show she can book. We let the public fall entirely in love with her tragic story. We let the crowdfunding account fill up. We wait exactly 48 hours for her narrative to peak. Then we drop the audio." For 2 consecutive days, Abigail absolutely saturated the media. She gave exclusive interviews to lifestyle magazines, portraying herself as a terrified prisoner in her own mansion. She claimed she was actively fleeing the city to protect her child from my supposed violent tendencies. The public outrage directed at me grew intense, with opinion pieces calling for my immediate investigation by Adult Protective Services. I remained entirely silent, comfortably sealed inside my secure tower, drinking espresso and watching the timer tick down. On Thursday morning, just as Abigail was scheduled to appear for her biggest primetime television interview yet, I gave Thomas the green light. We did not send the audio files to the local police, and we did not release them on our own. We sent the digital files directly to the top investigative journalists at 3 major rival news networks who were desperate to tear down the exclusive story Abigail had given their competitor. We sent the raw, unedited audio from the hidden camera in the guest house where she casually discussed locking me in a psychiatric ward just to steal my property. And most importantly, we sent the crystal-clear digital recording from the industrial diner where she explicitly offered to sell Jordan's encrypted hard drive for $5 million to an untraceable offshore account. The detonation was instantaneous and absolute. At noon, the rival networks broke into their regular daytime programming to air the leaked audio. The very same public that had wept for her the day before now sat in their living rooms listening to her cold, calculating voice hiss through their television speakers. They heard her call her husband a sinking ship. They heard her demand $5 million in untraceable funds. They heard her explicitly confess to hiding material evidence from the Federal Bureau of Investigation to secure her own payout. The backlash was unprecedented. The internet turned on her with a vicious collective fury. The crowdfunding campaign was immediately frozen by the platform administrators and investigated for wire fraud. Her high-priced crisis management team dropped her as a client within the hour, issuing a frantic public statement distancing themselves from her entirely. The primetime interview she was supposed to attend that evening was abruptly canceled, the network refusing to let her on their property. Instead of sitting in a glamorous makeup chair, Abigail found herself trapped. A local news helicopter captured live aerial footage of her standing in the driveway of a rented suburban house, frantically throwing designer suitcases into the trunk of a rental car. She was trying to run, but she never made it out of the driveway. 3 dark, unmarked federal SUVs pulled up, blocking her exit entirely. Several agents stepped out and approached her vehicle. They did not look sympathetic. They were the exact agents assigned to Jordan's corporate fraud case, and they had just heard her on national television admit to possessing and withholding the exact encrypted flash drive they needed to secure their conviction. The defamation war was officially over. Abigail had tried to weaponize the media against me, assuming her tears were stronger than my patience. But she forgot that the media has absolutely no loyalty. It feeds exclusively on scandal, and she had just provided them with the greatest feast of the year. Abigail was now completely isolated. Jordan hated her. The public despised her. and the federal government was standing in her driveway ready to tear her life apart looking for a silver piece of metal. The federal agents did not arrest Abigail in the driveway. They simply confiscated her passport, seized the encrypted flash drive from her trembling hands, and informed her she was an active target of a federal obstruction investigation. She retreated into the sprawling, empty mansion, pacing the imported marble floors like a trapped animal. The silence of the massive house was broken only by the heavy metallic click of the front door unlocking. Jordan walked in. He was no longer the immaculate tech visionary. His custom tuxedo was severely wrinkled. His tie was gone, and his eyes were hollow, rimmed with the deep purple exhaustion of a man who had spent the last 48 hours in a concrete federal holding cell. His high-priced defense attorney had managed to secure a temporary release bond, draining the last available drop of unfrozen liquid capital they possessed. Jordan stopped in the grand foyer. He looked across the room at the woman he had married. There was no relief in his eyes. There was only a cold, radioactive hatred. He had spent the morning listening to the audio recording provided by his lawyer. He had heard her exact words. He knew she had tried to sell his freedom for $5 million. Abigail froze by the sweeping staircase, her hands gripping the mahogany railing. She tried to formulate a defense, opening her mouth to weave another intricate lie, but Jordan cut her off. He did not yell. His voice was a terrifying, deadened rasp. "Pack a bag," he ordered, walking toward the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water from the tap. "The federal asset freeze goes into absolute effect by midnight. They are going to seize the bank accounts, the cars, and the equity." Abigail followed him, her panic overriding her guilt. "Where are we supposed to go?" "My credit cards are declining. The public relations firm dropped me. We have absolutely nothing." Jordan turned around, leaning heavily against the granite counter. "You should have thought about that before you tried to extort my father to fund your Cayman Islands escape plan. You called me a sinking ship." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "You were right, but you are strapped directly to the mast." The argument rapidly escalated into a vicious, deeply personal autopsy of their marriage. They hurled insults that targeted their deepest insecurities. Abigail screamed that Jordan was a massive fraud, a pathetic child who had to steal his father's work because he lacked any genuine talent of his own. Jordan fired back, calling her a shallow parasite who had contributed absolutely nothing to their wealth except spending it. During the screaming match, the context of their lavish lifestyle bubbled to the surface. 2 years ago, when Jordan's startup secured its first major round of venture capital, he had insisted on buying this $10 million estate in the most exclusive zip code of Chicago. He wanted to instantly legitimize himself among the old money billionaires. To avoid massive property taxes and shield the asset from potential startup litigation, his financial advisors had structured the purchase through a blind corporate holding entity named Vanguard Horizon Management. Jordan had transferred the title of the house to this holding company, confident that he controlled the corporate structure entirely. He believed he had built an impenetrable fortress of wealth. Jordan was so arrogant, so blindly focused on scaling his software company and maintaining his public image that he rarely read the dense financial paperwork his accountants put in front of him. He signed legal documents with the careless flick of a pen, assuming his brilliance protected him from mundane administrative risks. He believed that the tedious details of corporate structuring were beneath a visionary CEO. This fatal flaw was exactly what I had been quietly tracking for months. I knew that a man who delegates his financial security to strangers is a man leaving his front door wide open. The screaming match in the kitchen reached a fever pitch, with Abigail hurling a heavy crystal vase across the room. It shattered violently against the stainless steel refrigerator, sending shards of glass sliding across the polished floor. Before the glass could even settle, the heavy, authoritative chime of the front doorbell echoed through the mansion. They both froze instantly, the furious fight draining out of them. They expected to see federal agents returning to finish the job and drag Abigail away in handcuffs. Jordan walked slowly to the front door, his hands shaking as he pulled it open. It was not the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was the Cook County Sheriff, accompanied by 2 armed deputies and a man in a sharp gray suit holding a thick leather clipboard. The sheriff did not look sympathetic. He had a stern, no-nonsense demeanor that indicated he had performed this exact duty 1,000 times before. Jordan Washington, the sheriff, asked, his hand resting casually on his heavy utility belt. Jordan nodded, his chest tightening with a new, unfamiliar dread. "We are executing an immediate writ of possession," the sheriff stated, stepping aggressively into the grand foyer and forcing Jordan to back up. "You and anyone else inside this property have exactly 15 minutes to gather your personal effects and vacate the premises." The locksmith is outside right now. The locks are being changed immediately. Jordan stared at the uniformed officer, completely bewildered. A writ of possession. That is absolutely impossible. I am the sole owner of this property. I bought this estate 2 years ago. You cannot legally evict me from my own house. You have the wrong address. The man in the gray suit stepped forward, pulling a pen from his breast pocket. He was a ruthless property management lawyer. You are not the owner, Mr. Washington. The lawyer said, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. The deed to this estate belongs entirely to Vanguard Horizon Management. According to the official corporate registry, you are merely a tenant occupying the property on a month-to-month lease agreement. Jordan let out a frustrated, condescending sigh, aggressively rubbing his temples as if dealing with incompetent children. I own Vanguard Horizon Management, he snapped. It is my private holding company. I set it up specifically to purchase this estate. You people are making a massive jurisdictional error. The lawyer did not smile. He pulled a thick stack of certified corporate filings from his clipboard and handed it directly to Jordan. You did set it up 2 years ago. However, 9 months ago, when your startup required an emergency injection of capital to cover payroll, you authorized the sale of Vanguard Horizon's controlling shares to an anonymous private equity firm to secure the cash. You signed the transfer documents yourself. You sold the company that owns your house. Jordan looked down at the documents. His eyes scanned the heavy black ink tracking the complex corporate buyout he had carelessly approved and immediately forgotten about. He flipped frantically to the final page, searching for the signature of the private equity firm's principal director. The letters jumped off the page, burning themselves directly into his retinas. The sole managing director holding 100% of the shares and absolute control over the estate was Kenneth Washington. The realization struck Jordan with the devastating force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of his lungs. His father had not just outsmarted him with the patent fraud. His father had systematically legally purchased the very ground he walked on. I had bought the holding company for pennies on the dollar when Jordan was desperate for operational cash, effectively becoming my own son's landlord without him ever realizing it. Abigail looked over his trembling shoulder, reading the name clearly printed on the legal document. A horrifying, suffocating silence fell over the grand foyer. They had kicked me out of the small guest house in the middle of the night, claiming I was a worthless burden. Now I was legally throwing them out of the $10 million mansion they claimed as their kingdom. 15 minutes, the sheriff repeated loudly, tapping the glass face of his watch. They did not argue. The fight was completely beaten out of them. They rushed up the sweeping staircase in a mindless, pathetic panic, stuffing whatever clothing and loose cash they could find into cheap canvas duffel bags. When they walked back down and stepped out the front door, the locksmith was already drilling out the brass deadbolts. The heavy mahogany door slammed shut behind them with a definitive ringing thud. Jordan and Abigail stood on the manicured sidewalk of the exclusive neighborhood holding their bags. The neighbors they had tried so hard to impress were watching from their windows. The Range Rover in the driveway was locked, heavily booted by a repo company that had arrived moments before to secure the vehicle ahead of the federal freeze. They had no cars, no credit, and no home. The sun began to set, casting long, cold shadows across the pavement. They were completely exposed to the elements, finally facing the exact same humiliating reality they had forced upon me. The cold Chicago wind ripped through the manicured suburban street. Jordan and Abigail stood frozen on the sidewalk, clutching their cheap canvas duffel bags as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. The heavy mahogany door of their former $10 million mansion was locked, secured by a landlord they never knew existed until 15 minutes ago. The Range Rover sitting in the driveway was immobilized by a heavy yellow steel boot. Abigail dropped her bag onto the concrete. She did not scream or throw a tantrum this time. The sheer magnitude of their sudden absolute poverty had pushed her past hysteria into a state of catatonic shock. Jordan pulled out his smartphone. The screen was cracked from when he had dropped it during his arrest on the museum stage. He frantically checked his banking applications. The federal freeze was absolute and unforgiving. Every checking, savings, and joint account displayed a terrifying zero balance, locked under a severe government mandate. He pulled open his digital wallet, searching desperately for any line of credit that had not yet been flagged by the banking algorithms. He found a single low-limit emergency credit card he had opened years ago and forgotten about. It had exactly $300 of available credit. He used it to order a budget rideshare vehicle. When the dented, foul-smelling sedan pulled up to the curb, The wealthy neighbors peeked through their expensive silk blinds, watching the disgraced tech visionary load his worldly possessions into a car that cost less than the shoes he was wearing. They spent the night in a decaying roadside motel on the far outskirts of the city. The small room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial bleach, illuminated only by the harsh orange glow of a street lamp bleeding through the thin, stained curtains. Jordan sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, his head buried in his hands. He had not slept a single second. His mind was racing, trying to calculate a mathematical escape route from a maze that had no exit. When Jordan was 22, right after he graduated from college, I had given him a piece of financial advice. I told him that debt is a ruthless master, and that borrowing money to buy prestige is the fastest way to build a permanent prison. He had laughed at me, calling my financial conservatism a tragic symptom of a poverty mindset. He believed that extreme leverage was the ultimate tool of the wealthy elite. Over the past 2 years, he had leveraged absolutely everything. He had taken out a massive $5 million personal bridge loan to finance a luxury ski lodge in Aspen, using his founder's shares in the startup as collateral. It was a high-risk financial maneuver that entirely depended on the Apex Global acquisition going through perfectly. Now the acquisition was dead, the startup was frozen in a massive federal scandal, and those founder shares were completely worthless. By 8 in the morning, Jordan's phone began vibrating relentlessly on the cheap laminate nightstand. The automated emails were pouring in. The luxury bridge loan had a strict morality clause and a criminal indictment trigger written deep into the fine print. The bank was legally calling in the entire $5 million principal, demanding immediate payment in full. He was already facing 20 years in federal prison for the forged patent, but this was an immediate, crushing civil disaster. If he did not pay the balance within 48 hours, the creditors would file an involuntary bankruptcy petition. They would liquidate his last remaining hidden assets and leave him with nothing but a mountain of undischargeable fraud debt. Jordan grabbed his wrinkled suit jacket and left Abigail sleeping fitfully on the terrible motel bed. He took a long, humiliating city bus ride into the financial district, clutching a cardboard cup of cheap gas station coffee. He intended to walk right into the corporate headquarters of the national bank that issued the bridge loan. He planned to use his remaining charm to negotiate a stay of execution, to beg the loan officers for a 30-day grace period to liquidate some assets. When he finally reached the towering glass building, he did not even make it past the lobby security desk. The stern security guard recognized his face from the morning news broadcasts. He blocked Jordan from the elevators and handed him a thick, sealed envelope left at the front desk by the bank's legal department. Jordan ripped the envelope open, his hands trembling violently. He pulled out a formal notice of debt assignment. The national bank had entirely divested themselves of his toxic financial portfolio. They had sold his $5 million bridge loan, his maxed-out platinum credit cards, and the outstanding margin calls on his brokerage accounts to a private, aggressive, distressed debt acquisition firm. Jordan scanned the dense legal text, his eyes darting frantically across the page to find the name of the new creditor. He needed to know who held the leash to his absolute ruin. He found the bold print at the bottom of the second page. The debt had been purchased in its entirety by Vanguard Horizon Management, which was explicitly listed as acting as a subsidiary proxy for a larger private equity fund named the Thorn Capital Group. Jordan stopped breathing. The air in the pristine, air-conditioned lobby suddenly felt impossibly thin, suffocating his lungs. The Thorn Capital Group was entirely owned and operated by Dominic Thorn. It was the exact same reclusive billionaire who had stood up at the charity gala just a few days ago. The man who had effortlessly dropped a $2 million check onto my table and publicly declared he was buying my freedom. The horrifying realization slammed into Jordan with the devastating force of a concrete wall. This was not a random corporate debt sell-off driven by banking algorithms. This was a targeted, meticulously engineered financial assassination. Dominic Thorn had not just humiliated him at the charity auction. Thorn had deliberately waited for the federal indictment to destroy Jordan's credit rating, watched the national bank panic over the toxic loan, and then swooped in to buy Jordan's entire mountain of debt for pennies on the dollar. Jordan was now personally, legally, and entirely owned by the man who had fiercely defended his father. He stumbled out of the bank lobby, the bustling Chicago crowd rushing past him in a blur of expensive wool coats and leather briefcases. He leaned heavily against a cold stone pillar, gasping for air as a severe panic attack seized his chest. He pulled out his phone and frantically searched the public registry for the Thorn Capital Group. He found their corporate headquarters located just 3 blocks away in an imposing black steel skyscraper that dominated the skyline. The financial trap was utterly complete. Jordan had no leverage, no hidden cash reserves, no elite defense lawyers, and no allies left in the city. If he defaulted on the debt held by Thorn Capital, their aggressive corporate litigators would file secondary civil fraud charges based on the original loan applications. This ensured that even if he somehow managed to beat the federal forgery case through a technicality, he would spend the rest of his natural life trapped in endless brutal civil litigation, having his minimum wage earnings garnished until the day he died. There was absolutely no way to outrun this. He could not leverage a new lie to investors. He could not manipulate the press with a fake public relations campaign. The brilliant visionary tech chief executive was reduced to a desperate broken debtor owing millions to a ruthless billionaire predator. He looked up at the towering black skyscraper cutting sharply through the gray Chicago clouds. He knew exactly what he had to do to survive the week. He had to walk into the belly of the beast. He had to ride the private elevator up to the top floor, get on his hands and knees in front of Dominic Thorne, and beg a complete stranger for financial mercy. He began walking slowly toward the Black Tower, entirely unaware that Dominic Thorne was merely an actor playing a designated role, and that the man waiting for him in the highest office was someone far more dangerous. While Jordan was walking toward the imposing black skyscraper of Thorn Capital completely broken and seeking mercy, Abigail was waking up in that decaying roadside motel. She did not wait for him to return. She did not call his phone to check on his mental state or his physical safety. The moment he left the suffocating room, she packed her single canvas duffel bag and ordered another cheap rideshare. Her destination was not a financial institution, nor was it a friend's house. It was the sprawling downtown county courthouse. She had spent the entire restless night formulating a vicious survival strategy, staring at the stained ceiling of the motel. She knew Jordan was drowning in legal trouble, but her greed blinded her to the reality of his complete financial ruin. She fiercely believed he still possessed hidden offshore accounts or untouchable trusts that the federal government had not yet located. She wanted to file for divorce immediately to legally sever herself from his criminal liability while simultaneously using the family court system to extract half of whatever wealth he had managed to conceal. She hired a notoriously aggressive family law attorney who worked entirely on contingency, a shark of a man known throughout Chicago for extracting blood from stones and destroying families for a massive percentage of the settlement. By noon, her attorney had filed an emergency petition for dissolution of marriage. The legal document was a masterpiece of greedy fiction. Abigail requested sole physical and legal custody of Leo, demanding $50,000 a month in spousal support and an immediate equitable division of all marital assets. She explicitly listed the $10 million mansion, the luxury vehicles, and the startup equity as joint property, completely ignoring the reality that those assets were either seized by federal agents or legally owned by my holding company. Because Thomas Reed was actively managing the distressed debt portfolio we had just purchased from the National Bank, our firm was legally registered as Jordan's primary creditor. Therefore, Thomas received an immediate electronic notification the moment Abigail's divorce petition hit the county docket. We were sitting in his office when the alert flashed on his monitor. He printed the document, read through her absurd financial demands, and handed the heavy paper across the desk to me with a cold, hollow laugh. "She is demanding half the kingdom," Thomas noted, shaking his head at her sheer audacity. "She still does not understand that the kingdom burned to the ground 3 days ago." We did not intervene. We let the legal process run its natural devastating course. Because of the federal criminal indictment and the immediate threat of asset dissipation, the family court judge scheduled an expedited emergency financial mediation hearing for the very next morning. The hearing took place in a sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room inside the county courthouse. I was not legally required to attend, but as the primary creditor holding the multi-million-dollar debt, Thomas Reed secured us seats at the back of the room as interested third parties. We walked in quietly and sat in the back row. Abigail sat on one side of the long wooden table, flanked by her aggressive contingency lawyer. She had managed to have her hair professionally styled and was wearing a sharp-tailored navy suit. She looked remarkably confident, projecting the aura of an abused wife stepping bravely into her hard-won independence. Jordan sat on the exact opposite side of the table. He looked like a walking corpse. He was unwashed, his eyes sunken and completely devoid of life. He did not have a high-priced divorce attorney. He was accompanied by a court-appointed public defender who was desperately flipping through a massive stack of federal financial disclosures. The mediator, a tired former judge with a stern demeanor, called the room to order. Abigail's lawyer immediately launched into a theatrical, aggressive opening statement. He painted Jordan as a financial tyrant who had hidden millions of dollars in untraceable startup equity from his loving wife. He slammed a printed spreadsheet onto the table, demanding that Jordan liquidate his remaining stock options to fund an escrow account for Abigail's immediate living expenses. He demanded the judge award Abigail the primary residence, completely unaware that the locks had already been changed by the county sheriff on my direct orders. Jordan did not argue. He did not yell or defend himself. He simply stared blankly at the wood grain of the table, entirely broken. Abigail watched his silence and smiled, misinterpreting his absolute despair as a legal surrender. She thought she had him backed into a corner. She genuinely believed she was about to walk out of that courthouse a millionaire. The mediator turned to Jordan's public defender, asking for a response to the aggressive financial demands. The young public defender sighed heavily, placing a certified federal financial affidavit directly in the center of the table. "Your Honor, opposing counsel is operating under a severe delusion regarding the marital estate." The public defender stated, his voice flat and exhausted. "There are no hidden assets. There is no escrow account. The startup equity is currently valued at $0 due to the pending federal fraud indictment. The primary residence they are fighting over is owned by a private holding company, and my client was legally evicted days ago. Furthermore, all liquid cash in their joint accounts has been completely frozen by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Abigail's confident smile faltered slightly, but she quickly masked it with pure indignation. "He is lying," she snapped, leaning aggressively over the table. "He took out a $5 million personal bridge loan last month. We used it to secure commercial property in Aspen. I want half of that loan dispersed to me immediately." The mediator adjusted his glasses, picking up the certified affidavit and reading the final page. He looked up at Abigail, his expression shifting rapidly from boredom to profound pity. "Mrs. Washington," the mediator said slowly, tapping the heavy document with his pen, "the bridge loan was called in entirely by the creditors yesterday morning due to the criminal indictment. Your husband does not have $5 million. He owes $5 million. In addition to the maxed-out credit lines and the severe margin calls on his brokerage accounts, the total outstanding marital debt currently sits at exactly $20 million. Abigail froze. Her eyes darted wildly between the mediator, her aggressive lawyer, and her silent, broken husband. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice dropping to a terrified, breathless whisper. Her contingency lawyer stopped taking notes, dropping his gold pen onto the table. He suddenly realized he was never going to see a single dime from this case. "It means," the mediator explained coldly, "that Illinois is an equitable distribution state. You filed for divorce, demanding exactly 50% of the marital estate. Since there are absolutely zero positive assets remaining, the court must divide the liabilities. By legally severing this marriage today, you are not walking away with millions in spousal support. You are legally inheriting exactly half of the debt incurred during the marriage. You are walking out of this room carrying $10 million in undischargeable corporate and civil debt." The silence in the mediation room was absolutely deafening. Abigail's perfectly tailored facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The staggering mathematical reality crashed over her with the devastating weight of an ocean. She had tried to abandon a sinking ship by jumping into a lifeboat, only to realize she had chained herself directly to the anchor. She looked at her hands, trembling violently against the dark wood of the table. $10 million. She would never be able to declare standard bankruptcy to escape it because the debt was intimately tied to a federal fraud investigation. Every paycheck she ever earned, every minor asset she ever acquired for the rest of her natural life would be aggressively garnished by the Thorn Capital Group. She turned her head slowly and locked eyes with me, sitting quietly in the back row. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply offered her a slow, deliberate nod of confirmation. Her aggressive lawyer quietly packed his briefcase, zipped it shut, and walked out of the room without saying a single word to her, abandoning her completely. Abigail let out a low, guttural sob, collapsing forward until her forehead hit the table. She had fiercely demanded 50% of Jordan's life, and the law had ruthlessly granted her exactly what she asked for. The heavy black glass doors of the Thorn Capital Group headquarters slid open silently, allowing the freezing Chicago wind to push Jordan into the sprawling, immaculate lobby. He was completely numb. The grueling bus ride across the city had stripped away the very last remnants of his executive pride. He walked across the polished slate floor, his expensive dress shoes scuffed and leaving faint gray streaks behind him. He approached the massive security desk, a sleek monolith of black marble manned by 3 armed guards in tailored suits. Jordan did not demand to see the chief executive officer with his usual arrogant bluster. He simply handed his state identification card to the head guard, his hands trembling visibly, and whispered that he needed to speak with Mr. Dominic Thorne regarding an emergency debt restructuring. He fully expected to be laughed out of the building or thrown onto the pavement by physical force. Instead, the guard glanced at the monitor, nodded respectfully, and handed Jordan a heavy metallic keycard. The guard pointed toward a private glass-enclosed elevator reserved exclusively for the executive penthouse. I knew the exact moment Jordan entered the building. I was sitting 80 floors above him watching the closed-circuit security feed on a massive digital display in the primary boardroom. I had left the county courthouse immediately after watching Abigail collapse under the crushing weight of her $10 million divorce debt. My black car had driven me directly to the skyscraper, the true nerve center of my financial operations. I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, an exact replica of the suit Dominic Thorne had worn to the charity gala. I turned away from the security monitors and walked into the chairman's private office. It was a cavernous room wrapped entirely in floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a godlike, unobstructed view of the sprawling Chicago metropolis. I sat down in the massive leather chair behind the dark mahogany desk and pressed a button on the armrest, smoothly rotating the chair so I was facing the windows, my back entirely turned to the heavy oak doors. I waited in the absolute heavy silence. The elevator doors chimed softly on the 80th floor. Jordan stepped out into a reception area that radiated intimidating, quiet wealth. There was no bustling administrative staff, only a single impeccably dressed executive assistant who did not even bother to look up from her screen. She simply pressed a silent buzzer under her desk. The heavy oak doors to the chairman's office unlocked with a deep, echoing click. Jordan pushed the doors open and stepped into the cavernous office. The thick, imported wool carpet completely silenced his footsteps. He stood near the entrance, wiping cold sweat from his forehead, gripping the edges of his ruined suit jacket. The room was dark, illuminated only by the gray ambient light of the overcast city filtering through the massive windows. He saw the high-backed leather chair turned away from him facing the skyline. He saw the silhouette of a man sitting in absolute stillness. "Mr. Thorne." Jordan began, his voice cracking violently, completely devoid of the smooth, charismatic pitch he used to charm venture capitalists. "Thank you for seeing me. I know I do not have an appointment. I know you just acquired my entire debt portfolio from the National Bank." The man in the chair did not move. He did not speak. Jordan took a tentative step forward, his desperation forcing him to continue his pathetic, rehearsed speech. "I know my financial profile looks like a toxic wasteland right now. I know I am currently facing a federal indictment regarding the Apex Global acquisition. But you are a brilliant investor, sir. You stood up at my charity gala and offered $2 million for my father. You see value where others do not. You have to look past the current legal disaster. I am a visionary. I built that predictive routing algorithm. I built a $100 million company from nothing. If you give me a grace period, if you stop the bankruptcy proceedings, and use your legal team to help me settle this federal case, I will spend the rest of my natural life working exclusively for you. I will sign over 100% of my future equity. I will be your permanent employee. Just please do not liquidate me. Do not send me to prison. I am begging you for mercy." The silence that followed his desperate plea was incredibly heavy, thick with the weight of decades of unacknowledged sacrifices. I placed my hands on the polished mahogany armrests. "You did not build a $100 million company from nothing, Jordan," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the dark expanse of the office. "You built a house of cards on a foundation of stolen property, and the wind finally blew." Jordan froze completely. The blood vanished from his face, rushing away so quickly he swayed on his feet. He recognized the voice instantly, but his rational mind violently rejected the impossible reality. It could not be. It defied the laws of the universe he had constructed in his arrogant mind. I pressed my foot gently against the floor and rotated the heavy leather chair around to face him. The look on his face was something I will remember for the rest of my life. It was the absolute catastrophic failure of his entire psychological framework. He stared at me sitting behind the chairman's desk in the 80-story skyscraper surrounded by unimaginable wealth and absolute corporate power. His mouth hung open, his eyes wide and unblinking, his chest heaving irregularly as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. "Dad," he whispered, the words slipping from his lips like a dying breath. "What are you doing here? Where is Dominic Thorne?" "Dominic Thorne is a highly compensated proxy," I replied smoothly, leaning back in the chair. "He is an exceptionally talented financial actor. I hired him 10 years ago to serve as the public face of the Thorne Capital Group because I preferred to operate in the shadows. I prefer quiet observation to public adulation. It is a lesson you profoundly failed to learn." Jordan took a staggering step backward, hitting the heavy oak doors behind him. You own the holding company. You bought my debt. I bought the debt, I bought the mansion, and I funded every single round of venture capital your startup ever received through anonymous shell corporations. I confirmed, letting the absolute truth crush him. I let you play the role of the self-made genius. I let you stand on the stages and accept the awards. I wanted you to succeed, Jordan. But you became a monster. You began to view my quiet support as pathetic weakness. You viewed my humble lifestyle as a source of deep social embarrassment. You tried to sell me for $2 for a cheap laugh in front of the very people whose money I actually control. But the patent Jordan choked out, tears of genuine agonizing terror spilling down his cheeks. The federal indictment, the FBI. You sent them. I simply stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own criminal actions, I said coldly. You forged my signature to steal my intellectual property. You committed federal wire fraud. I am not the villain of your story, Jordan. I am simply the mirror reflecting your profound ugliness. Jordan collapsed. His knees buckled entirely and he dropped onto the thick wool carpet. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, dragging his ruined suit across the floor until he reached the edge of my mahogany desk. He looked up at me, his face a distorted mask of absolute despair. He realized that the old, boring father he had violently discarded was actually the architect of his entire reality. He realized he was not begging a stranger for mercy. He was begging the man he had betrayed. "Please, Dad," Jordan sobbed, wrapping his hands around the polished wooden leg of the desk. "I am so sorry. I was blind. I was poisoned by the money and Abigail's greed. Please call the federal agents off. I will go to a rehabilitation center. I will do whatever you want. If I am convicted of federal forgery, I will spend 20 years in a maximum security prison. I will never survive it. I will never see Leo grow up. Please, you are my father. You have to save me." I looked down at the broken, sniveling shell of a man weeping on my floor. I felt absolutely no pity. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small, silver-framed photograph. I placed it gently on the edge of the desk facing him. It was a picture of a beautiful, exhausted woman smiling warmly. It was his mother, Cynthia. "Do you remember her?" I asked softly. "Do you remember how she worked double shifts at the municipal hospital scrubbing floors until her hands bled just to pay for your expensive private school tuition? She died of sheer exhaustion when you were a sophomore in college, and you were too busy attending a fraternity party to come to her funeral. You have not visited her grave in 15 years. You have no right to invoke the sanctity of family." I pressed a button on the intercom system. "Thomas, bring it in." The side door of the office opened quietly. Thomas Reed stepped into the room holding a single thick legal document bound in heavy blue paper. He walked to the desk, ignoring Jordan completely, and placed the document squarely in front of me alongside a solid gold pen. "You correctly stated that you are facing 20 years in federal prison," I said, picking up the pen and holding it between my fingers. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation possesses the forged patent and the encrypted audio of Abigail attempting to hide evidence. However, they do not possess the final critical piece of metadata connecting the forgery directly to your personal computer's IP address. I hold that data on an encrypted offline server." Jordan stared at the gold pen, his eyes frantic. "What do you want? I will give you anything." I placed the pen on top of the blue document and pushed it to the edge of the desk, right in front of his face. "You are going to sign this document," I commanded, my voice turning into a heavy, unbreakable iron. "It is an irrevocable, permanent surrender of your parental rights. You are granting me absolute sole physical and legal custody of your son, Leo. You will waive all rights to visitation. You will never approach him, contact him, or attempt to communicate with him for the rest of his natural life. You will disappear entirely." Jordan recoiled as if the document was physically burning on the desk. "You cannot do that. He is my son. You cannot take my son away from me." I leaned forward, locking my eyes with his terrified stare. "You just watched your wife happily accept $10 million of your debt because she was too blinded by greed to read a financial disclosure. She is currently packing her bags to flee the state, knowing the feds are watching her every move. You have absolutely no money, no home, and a massive federal trial pending. You are an unfit criminal parent. I am the only safety net that child has left, and I refuse to let him be raised by two sociopathic narcissists. I tapped the thick paper with my finger. If you sign this document right now, I will instruct Thomas to formally retract the intellectual property complaint. We will legally classify the patent transfer as a complex civil licensing error rather than a criminal forgery. Without my active cooperation as the primary victim, the federal prosecutors will lose their star witness and their definitive evidence. They will drop the criminal indictment to avoid a lengthy, unwinnable trial. You will walk out of this building a free man, albeit completely broke and heavily in debt. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and placed it next to the document. The screen was displaying a drafted email addressed directly to the lead federal prosecutor containing the final encrypted metadata attachment. If you do not sign it, I continued softly, I press send. The federal agents will walk through those doors in 5 minutes. You will spend the next 20 years in a concrete box. Jordan stared at the document, the gold pen, and the glowing screen of the smartphone. His breathing was rapid, shallow, and panicked. He looked at the framed picture of his mother, then up at my completely unyielding face. He desperately wanted to find a third option, a clever loophole to escape the trap. But there was no loophole. He was trapped between absolute destruction and total surrender. He had to choose between his freedom and his child. He slowly reached up with a trembling hand and picked up the gold pen. He hesitated for 3 agonizing seconds, a single tear dropping onto the heavy blue paper. But his inherently selfish, cowardly nature finally overrode his fragile paternal instinct. He could not face the reality of a prison cell. He pressed the gold nib to the paper and frantically scrawled his signature across the bottom line, completely severing his legal and emotional ties to his own blood. He dropped the pen and slumped back onto the floor, pulling his knees into his chest, weeping uncontrollably into his dirty hands. Thomas Reed smoothly stepped forward, pulling the signed document away and sliding it into a secure leather folder. He nodded at me, a silent confirmation that the legal trap was sealed perfectly. I picked up my smartphone and deleted the drafted email. I looked down at the broken man crying on the floor of my office. "Get up!" I ordered, my voice devoid of any warmth or anger. Jordan slowly dragged himself to his feet, swaying weakly. He looked at me, his eyes begging for a shred of paternal comfort, a final word of forgiveness now that the transaction was complete. "You sold me for $2 at a gala to save your ego," I said quietly, turning my heavy leather chair back toward the massive windows to look out over the city. "And you just sold your own son to save your own skin. You are exactly the man I knew you were. You are no longer my son. Get out of my building and never return." Jordan stood in the suffocating silence for a moment longer. He realized there was nothing left to say. He turned around and walked slowly toward the heavy oak doors, his shoulders slumped, carrying the invisible, crushing weight of his absolute failure. The doors closed behind him with a deep, final click, severing our connection forever. The ultimate humiliation was complete. I had not destroyed him. I had simply forced him to destroy himself. The scent of fresh basil and organic citrus filled the bright, pristine aisles of the upscale grocery store. It was a quiet Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Jordan had signed his paternal rights away on my mahogany desk and vanished into the bitter Chicago wind. The relentless chaos that had consumed my life was finally giving way to a profound, steady peace. I pushed a silver shopping cart down the produce aisle. My 3-year-old grandson Leo sat happily in the child seat, swinging his legs and holding a bright red apple. I watched him smile, feeling a deep, quiet warmth radiate through my chest. I had spent my entire adult life sacrificing my own comfort for a son who ultimately viewed me as a disposable asset. I was not going to make that same mistake with Leo. I was going to raise him in an environment defined by absolute truth, firm boundaries, and genuine respect. Our quiet morning was abruptly shattered by the violent crash of a plastic shopping basket hitting the polished linoleum floor. I stopped the cart and turned around. Standing at the end of the aisle, entirely blocking our exit, was Abigail. The visual transformation she had undergone in just 3 weeks was absolutely staggering. The immaculate emerald gown-wearing socialite was completely gone, replaced by a frantic, hollowed-out ghost. Her designer clothes hung loosely on her shrinking frame, stained and deeply wrinkled from sleeping in cheap transient motels. Her blonde hair was unwashed and tied back in a messy knot. The heavy diamond wedding ring she used to flaunt was missing, undoubtedly sold to a pawn shop for a fraction of its value just to buy food and burner phones. The federal government had successfully frozen every single bank account associated with her name. She was currently suffocating under the $10 million marital debt she had arrogantly demanded during her disastrous divorce hearing. She had absolutely nothing left to her name except her own toxic entitlement. She had been tracking my movements. The private security team I hired for the Zenith Tower had reported a woman matching her description pacing the perimeter sidewalks for the last 4 days. She could not bypass the biometric security of my building, so she had followed my private town car to the market. She was driven by a feral, calculating desperation. Leo, Abigail gasped, her voice cracking with a manic, artificial emotional intensity. She took a step forward, her eyes darting frantically around the grocery store to ensure there was an audience. "Oh my God, my baby. What has he done to you?" I did not move. I kept my hands resting lightly on the handle of the shopping cart, placing my body firmly between her and my grandson. "You are violating a federal mandate, Abigail," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and quiet so as not to frighten the child. "Turn around and walk out the automatic doors right now." Weeks ago, Abigail had weaponized the legal system by filing a fraudulent emergency injunction against me, claiming I was violently demented. She had used Leo as a human shield to extort a forgery retraction. Thomas Reed had systematically dismantled that pathetic lie during the final custody hearings. When Jordan formally surrendered his parental rights to avoid federal prison, Thomas presented the family court judge with the leaked audio of Abigail attempting to sell criminal evidence for an offshore payout. The judge was completely appalled. Recognizing her as a severe flight risk and an actively investigated felon, the court permanently stripped her of all custodial rights. Furthermore, the judge issued a strict, non-negotiable protective order. Abigail was legally forbidden from coming within 500 feet of me or my grandson. She ignored my warning completely. She wanted a public spectacle. She wanted to leverage the presence of wealthy shoppers to force my hand, relying on the exact same manipulative tactics that had ruined her life in the first place. "Help me!" Abigail suddenly screamed at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice echoing violently through the high ceilings of the grocery store. "Somebody please help me. This man kidnapped my son. He stole my baby." Shoppers froze in their tracks. Mothers pulled their children close, and men in business suits stopped inspecting the artisan cheeses. A crowd began to form rapidly at the edges of the produce aisle. Abigail dropped to her knees, weeping hysterically, throwing her hands up toward the ceiling in a perfectly rehearsed display of maternal agony. "He is a monster," she wailed, pointing a trembling accusatory finger directly at my face. "He took all my money and locked me out of my own house. He bribed the judges. Please do not let him take my baby away. Call the police. Arrest him." For a brief, terrifying moment, the crowd looked at me with deep suspicion. But Abigail severely overestimated the public's amnesia. This was an affluent downtown market catering to the exact same demographic that had watched her spectacular primetime downfall on the evening news. They were the people who had listened to the leaked audio recordings of her coldly demanding $5 million in untraceable funds to sell out her own husband. A woman standing near the organic tomatoes pulled out her smartphone, but she did not dial emergency services. She opened her camera application and pointed the lens directly at Abigail. "That is the tech executive's wife," the woman said loudly, her voice cutting cleanly through Abigail's theatrical sobbing. "The one who tried to extort her father-in-law on national television." The atmosphere in the grocery store shifted instantly. The initial wave of public sympathy evaporated, replaced by a cold, collective disgust. More shoppers pulled out their phones, creating a solid wall of digital recording devices. They were not stepping forward to rescue a distressed mother. They were documenting the pathetic breakdown of a disgraced, greedy fraud. Abigail realized the crowd was not turning against me. The panic in her eyes became genuine. She scrambled to her feet, abandoning the theatrical tears, and lunged aggressively toward the shopping cart. She reached out her hands, curving into claws, attempting to physically grab Leo by his small jacket. I moved with a speed and precision she completely failed to anticipate. I stepped directly into her path, intercepting her wrists and pushing her back with a firm, unyielding force. She stumbled backward, hitting a display of green apples and sending the fruit spilling across the floor. "Do not ever reach for him again," I commanded, my voice dropping to a freezing absolute register that commanded the entire aisle. Store security guards wearing dark blazers rushed down the aisle, immediately stepping between us. The store manager, a tall man holding a two-way radio, looked at me respectfully. "Mr. Washington, are you and your grandson all right?" he asked. "We have already dispatched the local authorities. They are pulling into the parking lot right now. Abigail spun around, her face twisted into an ugly, feral snarl. She shoved the security guard directly in the chest. "Get your hands off me, you minimum wage trash," she shrieked, completely losing her grip on reality. "I am Abigail Washington. I am a member of the Zenith Country Club. You work for me. I demand you arrest that old man." The automatic glass doors at the front of the store slid open. Two uniformed police officers walked briskly through the checkout lanes, their hands resting on their heavy utility belts. The store manager pointed directly at Abigail. The officers approached her rapidly. "Ma'am, you need to calm down and step away from the customers," the lead officer instructed, assessing the chaotic scene. Abigail immediately tried to pivot back to her victim narrative. "Officers, thank God," she cried, attempting to smooth her dirty clothes. "That man is Kenneth Washington. He stole my child. He is holding my son hostage. I demand you take my baby back right now." The lead officer pulled out a small digital terminal and typed her name into the federal database. He did not look at me. He waited for the screen to load. When the text flashed across his device, his demeanor changed from routine caution to immediate strict enforcement. "Abigail Washington," the officer said, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "You are currently out on federal bail pending a massive obstruction of justice investigation. And there is an active permanent protective order mandating that you remain at least 500 feet away from Kenneth Washington and the minor child, Leo Washington." Abigail froze, her mouth opening and closing silently. The aggressive arrogance completely drained out of her, leaving only the terrifying realization of her own fatal mistake. She had been so desperate to cause a public scene that she had entirely forgotten the severe legal parameters of her own release. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the officer commanded, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "I did not know he was going to be here." Abigail lied frantically, backing away toward the spilled apples. "It was an accident. I just wanted to buy groceries. You cannot arrest me for shopping. You approached the protected parties, caused a physical altercation, and attempted to bypass store security," the officer stated, grabbing her arm firmly and spinning her around. "By violating a permanent family court injunction, you are in direct violation of your federal release conditions. Your bail is officially revoked." The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly down the produce aisle. It was the exact same sound her husband had heard on the museum stage. Abigail began to thrash violently, screaming incoherent threats and sobbing wildly as the two officers dragged her toward the front of the store. The crowd parted, keeping their cameras steadily trained on her humiliated, dirty face. She kicked at the automatic glass doors as they forced her out onto the pavement and shoved her into the back of the waiting patrol cruiser. She had tried to weaponize a public space to destroy my peace, and she had ultimately secured her own immediate incarceration. Without the possibility of bail, she would remain locked inside a concrete federal holding cell until her extortion trial began. I stood in the quiet grocery aisle, adjusting my jacket. The store manager offered a profuse apology, but I simply shook my head and thanked him for his rapid response. I turned back to the shopping cart. Leo was holding his red apple, looking up at me with wide, curious eyes, completely unharmed and entirely unbothered by the screaming woman who had just been hauled away. I smiled at my grandson, pushing the cart forward toward the bakery. The toxic remnants of the past had finally been permanently removed. The correction was absolute. 6 months slipped by with the quiet, steady rhythm of a metronome washing away the chaotic debris of the past. The relentless media frenzy surrounding the Apex Global scandal had finally burned itself out, replaced by whatever new tragedy the news cycle demanded. Abigail remained locked inside a federal detention center, her repeated requests for bail categorically denied by a judge who viewed her as a massive flight risk. With the toxic elements permanently excised from my life, I focused entirely on building a healthy environment for my grandson. The Zenith Tower was a magnificent architectural marvel, but a growing 3-year-old boy does not need a 75th floor balcony. He needs solid earth-green grass and room to run. I purchased a sprawling, heavily wooded estate in the northern suburbs of Chicago. The property was completely surrounded by a 10-foot wrought iron perimeter fence and secured by a state-of-the-art biometric surveillance system. It was a fortress of peace entirely isolated from the ruthless ambition of the city. It was late November when the past finally crawled its way to my front door. A massive autumn storm had rolled off Lake Michigan, plunging the entire region into a freezing torrential downpour. The wind howled through the ancient oak trees lining my driveway, violently shaking the heavy branches. Inside the main house, the atmosphere was entirely different. A warm fire crackled in the stone hearth of the living room. Leo was fast asleep upstairs in his custom-built bedroom, safely tucked beneath a heavy quilt, completely unaware of the raging storm outside. I was sitting in my leather armchair reading a book on early childhood psychology, enjoying the profound silence of the evening. At exactly 11 o'clock, the silent security tablet resting on my side table illuminated the dark room. The perimeter breach alarm flashed a solid warning yellow. Someone had triggered the motion sensors at the primary front gate. I set my book down and picked up the tablet. I tapped the screen, bringing up the high-definition night vision feed from the camera mounted above the heavy iron gates. The freezing rain was coming down in thick gray sheets, distorting the lens slightly. Standing directly in front of the gate, gripping the thick iron bars with both hands, was a man. He was swaying heavily on his feet, his head bowed against the punishing wind. He was wearing a thin, filthy canvas jacket that was completely soaked through. His pants were torn at the knees, and his shoes appeared to be held together by thick layers of gray duct tape. He looked like a fragile, broken ghost attempting to haunt a world he no longer belonged to. I zoomed the camera in on his face. The sharp, arrogant jawline was buried under months of unkempt, matted beard. His cheeks were violently hollowed out, his skin carrying the sickly, pale pallor of severe malnutrition and chronic exposure to the elements. It took me several seconds to fully recognize the man staring blankly into the camera lens. It was Jordan, the golden boy of the tech industry. The self-proclaimed visionary who had once commanded a $100 million boardroom was now a destitute beggar standing in the freezing mud. The sheer magnitude of his physical deterioration was staggering. The merciless reality of his $20 million debt had hunted him to the absolute edges of society. I did not feel a sudden surge of paternal panic. I did not rush to the electronic control panel to throw the gates open. I simply stood up, walked to the front foyer, and put on a heavy waterproof winter coat. I grabbed a large black umbrella from the brass stand and stepped out the front door. The freezing rain immediately battered the top of the umbrella, the sound incredibly loud in the dark night. I walked slowly down the long, winding cobblestone driveway. The walk took me 3 full minutes. I used that time to steel my emotions, ensuring that I would not be manipulated by the pathetic visual display waiting for me at the perimeter. When I finally reached the gate, I stopped exactly 5 feet away from the iron bars. I did not reach for the electronic keypad. Jordan looked up. The rain was streaming down his face, washing away the grime, but leaving the profound despair completely intact. He pressed his face against the cold iron bars, his eyes wide and desperate. "Dad," he gasped, his voice a fragile, broken rasp that barely carried over the howling wind. "Thank God. I thought you might not come out. I thought you might just call the police." I stood perfectly still beneath the black umbrella. "You are trespassing on private property, Jordan. The security system flagged your presence. State your business, or I will alert the local authorities." He let out a pathetic, ragged sob, his knuckles turning stark white as he gripped the iron. "Please, Dad. Just listen to me. I have absolutely nothing left. The Thorn Capital lawyers took everything. They garnished the minimum wage paychecks I tried to earn washing dishes. They froze the prepaid debit cards I tried to open. The homeless shelters in the city are completely full, and the ones that are open are too dangerous. I have been sleeping under the highway overpass for 3 weeks. I am freezing. I am starving. I have not eaten a hot meal in 4 days." He collapsed onto his knees, the freezing mud soaking immediately into his torn pants. He looked up at me through the bars, entirely stripped of his pride, his ego, and his humanity. "I am sorry," he wept, the tears mixing seamlessly with the rain. "I am so incredibly sorry for everything I did. I was arrogant. I was stupid. I let the money completely poison my mind. I let Abigail convince me that we were untouchable. I know I committed terrible crimes against you. I know I forged the patent, and I know I treated you like garbage when you were just trying to help me. I realize that now. The street teaches you exactly what you are really worth, and I know I am worth nothing." He reached a trembling hand through the gap in the iron bars, desperately reaching toward the hem of my warm coat, though he was entirely too far away to touch it. "I am begging you for a second chance," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a hysterical pitch. "Please open the gate. Just let me sleep on the floor of your garage. Just let me come inside where it is warm. I will work for you. I will clean your house. I will pull the weeds in your garden. I will do absolutely anything you ask me to do for the rest of my life. You are my father. You raised me. You cannot leave your own flesh and blood out here to die in the freezing storm. Please, Dad, save me." I stood in the freezing rain and watched him cry. I listened to his desperate apologies. I listened to his promises of permanent servitude. I waited in the deafening roar of the storm for 10 long, agonizing minutes. I gave him absolutely every opportunity to prove that his suffering had somehow cultivated a genuine human soul. I waited for him to ask about Leo. I waited for him to ask if his 3-year-old son was happy in this new house. I waited for him to ask if Leo missed his parents, if he was eating well, if he was growing tall. I waited for a single shred of paternal curiosity to pierce through his own pathetic misery. He never mentioned the boy. He spent 10 minutes weeping about his wet clothes, his empty stomach, and his ruined reputation. His apology was entirely hollow. He was not sorry for the immense pain he had caused his family. He was only sorry that he had lost the game. He was mourning the death of his own comfort, entirely blind to the collateral damage he had inflicted on the innocent life he had brought into the world. "You did not come here to seek redemption," I said quietly. My voice cut through the howling wind, completely steady and devoid of any emotional warmth. "You came here seeking a blanket." Jordan stopped weeping for a fraction of a second, confusion flashing across his wet face. "What? You stood there and begged for your life for 10 minutes. I continued, taking a deliberate step closer to the iron bars. "You invoked the sacred title of family. You reminded me that I am your father, demanding that I fulfill my paternal duty to protect you from the storm. Yet in all of your pathetic begging, you did not ask about your own son a single time. You signed away your parental rights on my desk to save yourself from a federal prison cell, and you just proved that you have not thought about that child since the ink dried on the paper." Jordan stammered, his eyes darting frantically. "No, Dad, you do not understand. I just need to get warm. My mind is not working right. Of course I care about Leo. Just let me inside and we can talk about him." I tightened my grip on the handle of the umbrella. "You are exactly the man you were the night you auctioned me off for $2. The only difference is that your expensive suit has been replaced by rags. The core of your character remains completely rotten. You demand absolute sacrifice from everyone around you, but you refuse to sacrifice a single ounce of your own comfort for anyone else." Jordan realized the gate was not going to open. The desperate pleading rapidly morphed into the vicious, entitled anger that had always defined him. "You cannot do this to me," he screamed violently, shaking the heavy iron gates. "I am your son. You owe me. You have millions of dollars. You can fix this with a single phone call. Open the damn gate." I looked at him with absolute freezing clarity. A father's ultimate duty is not to blindly protect his child from the consequences of their own actions. A father's duty is to protect the innocent. My duty is to Leo. Bringing you into this house would be bringing a deadly, incurable infection into his sanctuary. I refuse to let him grow up watching a coward manipulate his way through life. I turned my back on the gate and began walking back up the cobblestone driveway. "Dad," Jordan shrieked, his voice tearing in his throat. "You are killing me. You are leaving me out here to die. Forgive me." I did not stop walking. I did not turn around. "The forgiveness you are looking for is a matter between you and whatever God you choose to pray to in the dark," I said over my shoulder, my words carrying clearly over the wind. "My job is done." I walked back to the massive front door, stepped inside, and locked the heavy deadbolt. I took off my wet coat and walked upstairs to check on my grandson. Leo was still sleeping peacefully, completely undisturbed by the storm raging outside. I pulled the heavy quilt a little higher over his shoulders and turned off the hallway light. The gate was shut permanently. The past was locked outside in the freezing rain where it belonged, and the future was sleeping safely in my house. The brutal Chicago winter eventually broke, giving way to a brilliant, vibrant spring. The 10-foot iron gates of my estate remained firmly closed to the past, but the grounds inside were entirely alive. I sat on the cedar porch holding a mug of dark roast coffee, watching my grandson run across the freshly cut grass. Leo was 4 years old now. The heavy shadows of his parents' greed had completely faded from his memory, replaced by the simple, profound joy of a childhood rooted in absolute security and unconditional respect. With my legal battles definitively won and my wealth fully secured, I turned my attention to the legacy of the woman who had sacrificed everything for our family. I worked closely with Thomas Reed to establish the Cynthia Washington Memorial Foundation. We funded a permanent multi-million-dollar endowment designed exclusively to provide full-ride university scholarships for underprivileged African-American students entering the fields of software engineering and medicine. I wanted to reward the young men and women who possessed the brilliance Jordan took for granted, the students who understood the grueling weight of their parents' sacrifices. When I shook the hands of our first scholarship recipients, I finally felt the deep, lingering grief of my wife's passing begin to heal. Her name was no longer attached to our son's spectacular failure. It was attached to genuine earned success. The outside world moved on, dealing its own harsh justice. Abigail was convicted of federal obstruction of justice and attempted extortion. She was sentenced to 8 years in a federal correctional facility. The wealthy socialites she once desperately courted did not attend her sentencing, completely erasing her from their circles. Jordan simply vanished. After the night of the terrible storm, he never approached my gates again. The Thorn Capital litigators systematically stripped away the final remnants of his corporate identity to satisfy his civil debts, leaving him as nothing more than a ghost wandering the concrete labyrinth of the city. I did not hire investigators to search for him. A man who absolutely refuses to learn from the fire belongs in the ashes. I put my coffee mug down and walked down the porch steps to join my grandson. Leo was sitting in the grass, struggling slightly to assemble a small wooden model airplane. I did not take the pieces from him to build it myself. I sat beside him patiently, guiding his small hands, teaching him how to align the wooden pegs and secure the wings. I was teaching him the value of patience, the quiet dignity of building something from scratch with your own hands. People often believe that family is an unbreakable contract, a biological obligation to endure endless toxicity and disrespect. I spent the majority of my life believing that dangerous lie. But the truth is much simpler. Family is a privilege and respect is the daily rent you pay to keep it. When the rent is no longer paid, you must change the locks. I am Kenneth Washington. I survived the auction block of my own son's ego, and in the end I executed a silent correction that bought back the only thing that truly mattered: my peace. I also learned that the loudest people in the room are often the most fragile. Jordan and Abigail spent their lives building a fortress of noise, using their performative status and borrowed wealth as a weapon to belittle anyone they deemed inferior. They fundamentally confused arrogance with strength. But true power does not need an audience, and genuine wealth does not require a stage. I learned that silence is never a symptom of weakness. When paired with absolute patience, silence becomes the most devastating response to cruelty, allowing the toxic echoes of their own actions to entirely destroy them. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments how you finally found the courage to set boundaries with toxic family members.